His wife mocked the nanny at the dinner, but when the billionaire returned from his business trip, what he saw left him speechless. The billionaire froze in his own doorway at midnight. His mocked, humiliated nanny, the woman his wife had publicly destroyed 3 days ago, was teaching his 6-year-old son advanced mathematics. On a whiteboard. In secret. And his son was staring at her like she'd unlocked the universe. Richard Robinson had walked past this woman for 3 years. Never asked her name twice. Never wondered why someone so brilliant was scrubbing his toilets. Now he was watching her explain calculus to a first grader. And everything, his marriage, his empire, his entire understanding of worth, was about to detonate. Before we enjoy this story, tell me in the comments section where you're watching from, and do not forget to like, share and subscribe to this wonderful channel. Let's go. The crystal chandelier cast 1,000 fragments of golden light across the Robinson mansion's dining room, each facet catching and throwing brilliance like scattered diamonds. Rachel Robinson sat at the head of the mahogany table, her emerald silk dress flowing perfectly against the upholstered chair, her diamond earrings catching the light with every calculated turn of her head. Around her, 8 of the city's most influential women laughed in that particular way wealthy people laugh. Controlled, musical, never too loud. The scent of imported roses mingled with roasted duck and aged wine. Crystal glasses clinked like delicate bells. Conversation flowed in practiced rhythms, each woman performing her role in this carefully choreographed evening. This was Rachel's domain, her kingdom, and she ruled it with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Near the kitchen door, almost invisible against the cream-colored walls, stood Mirabel. Her simple gray uniform was pressed and spotless, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her hand steady as she held a crystal water pitcher. She'd learned long ago how to occupy space without claiming it, how to be present without being seen. 3 years in this house had trained her in the art of invisibility. She moved between the guests with practiced efficiency, refilling glasses before they emptied, clearing plates the moment forks were set down. Her movements were quiet, fluid, designed not to interrupt the flow of conversation or draw attention to herself. The guests barely glanced at her. To them, she was part of the furniture, as decorative and functional as the silver candlesticks. "Rachel, darling, this duck is absolutely divine," Mrs. Hartwell exclaimed, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "You simply must share your chef's secrets." Rachel smiled, accepting the compliment as her due. It's all about knowing what you want and getting it. In food and in life. Laughter rippled around the table, that knowing laughter of women who'd never wanted for anything. From the adjacent sitting room came the soft sounds of a child playing. 6-year-old David Robinson sat on the Persian rug with his building blocks, constructing towers and bridges with focused concentration. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift toward the dining room, watching his mother hold court, sensing the performance of it all even if he couldn't name it. "How is young David doing?" Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice carrying the tone of polite inquiry that expected equally polite deflection. "Such a bright boy. Is he adjusting well to the academy?" Before Rachel could respond, David's small voice called out from the sitting room. "Miss Mirabel is teaching me about the stars. She says they're like—" "David, sweetheart, the adults are talking," Rachel interrupted smoothly, her smile never faltering. But Mirabel, standing near Mrs. Hartwell's chair with the water pitcher, felt the shift in the room's temperature. Mrs. Hartwell turned slightly, noticing Mirabel for perhaps the first time that evening. "Oh? The nanny teaches him astronomy." Mirabel's throat tightened. She hadn't meant for David to mention their evening lessons. They were supposed to be their secret, their special time after his homework was done and before bed. She'd been showing him constellations from his bedroom window, explaining how ancient sailors navigated by stars, how light traveled across impossible distances. "It's nothing formal, ma'am," Mirabel said quietly, her voice carefully neutral. "David is very curious. When he asks questions, I try to—" "Oh, don't mind her," Rachel cut in, her tone light but edged with something sharp. Amusement danced in her eyes, but it was the kind of amusement that came at someone else's expense. "Our nanny thinks she's some kind of teacher. It's quite charming, really." A ripple of laughter moved around the table. Polite, genteel laughter that sliced deeper than any blade. Mirabel's hands tightened imperceptibly on the pitcher's handle. She felt heat rising to her cheeks but forced her face to remain neutral, her smile fixed and empty. This was survival. This was her job. She'd endured worse and would endure more. But Rachel wasn't finished. She'd sensed weakness, or perhaps she'd simply decided that tonight required a demonstration of hierarchy. I mean really, she continued, warming to her audience. Domestic help these days. You give them an inch and they think they belong at the head of the class. More laughter. Mrs. Hartwell tittered behind her napkin. Mrs. Chun nodded knowingly. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, that tight smile of someone relieved not to be the target. David appeared in the doorway, his small face troubled. But Mom, Miss Mirabel knows everything. She's teaching me about David. Rachel's voice cut through the room like a knife through silk. Sweet but absolute. Go to your room, darling. The grown-ups are having dinner. But now. The boy's face crumpled. He looked at Mirabel, his eyes shining with unshed tears and something else. Shame, confusion, the helpless anger of a child watching someone he loved being hurt and being powerless to stop it. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that moment, Mirabel tried to convey everything she couldn't say aloud. It's okay. I'm okay. This isn't your fault. David fled up the stairs, and the sound of his bedroom door closing echoed through the mansion like a punctuation mark. Rachel took a delicate sip of wine, completely unbothered. Children, she sighed, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Now, where were we? Mrs. Chun, you simply must tell us about the charity gala you're planning. The conversation moved on. The dinner continued. Mirabel stood frozen for a heartbeat, her face burning, her hands trembling so slightly that only she could feel it. Then she did what she'd been trained to do. She lowered her gaze, steadied her breath, and continued serving. Rachel's voice drifted across the room, casual and cutting. Mirabel, dear, could you be a bit more attentive? Mrs. Hartwell's glass is nearly empty. Of course, ma'am. My apologies. Mirabel moved forward, refilled the glass, and retreated to her position near the wall. She became invisible again, or tried to. But inside, where no one could see, something twisted and ached. Not for herself. She'd grown accustomed to small cruelties, to being overlooked and underestimated. But for David, who'd tried to defend her and been silenced. For the boy who saw her as more than furniture, who asked her questions and listened to her answers with genuine wonder. The dinner stretched on. Course after course, laugh after laugh, hour after hour. Mirabel served and cleared, poured and smiled, existed in the margins of other people's joy. When Rachel caught her eye once, there was a flicker of something in her expression, satisfaction perhaps, or the confirmation of an established order. A reminder, this is my house. These are my people. You are not. Finally, mercifully, the evening wound down. Guests departed in clouds of perfume and air kisses, calling out their thanks and compliments. Rachel stood at the door, the perfect hostess until the very last moment, waving as luxury cars pulled away down the circular drive. The door closed. The mansion fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Rachel kicked off her heels and headed upstairs without a word to Mirabel, already pulling out her phone to check messages. Mirabel stood in the dining room surrounded by the wreckage of the evening. Lipstick-stained napkins. Half-empty wine glasses. Plates with elegant remnants of food that cost more than she made in a week. The chandelier still glittered overhead, indifferent and beautiful. She began to clean. Her movements were mechanical, automatic. Load the dishwasher. Wipe down the table. Blow out the candles. Put away the silver. But her hands still trembled, and behind her eyes, tears burned that she wouldn't allow to fall. The echo of laughter seemed to linger in the air like ghosts. Our nanny thinks she's some kind of teacher. The words played on repeat in her mind, each repetition a fresh cut. She paused near the window, looking out at the manicured gardens illuminated by landscape lighting. Beyond the walls of this estate lay the city, and beyond that, the world she'd left behind. Her mother's house. Her university dreams. The engineering degree she'd been 3 months from completing when her father died and everything collapsed. She pressed her palm against the cool glass. 3 years. 3 years of being invisible, of swallowing her dignity, of pretending she was less than she was. And for what? To send money home. To keep her siblings fed. To survive. A soft sound made her turn. David stood at the bottom of the stairs in his pajamas, his face streaked with tears. Miss Mirabel. His voice was small, broken. I'm sorry about Mom. I didn't mean to make her mad at you. Mirabel's heart cracked. She set down her cleaning cloth and knelt to his level, opening her arms. David rushed forward and buried his face against her shoulder. She held him, this small boy who somehow saw her when no one else did. "Sure, it's okay," she whispered, stroking his hair. "You didn't do anything wrong. But she was mean to you." And everyone laughed. People laugh sometimes when they don't understand things. It doesn't mean anything. It's not fair. His voice was muffled against her uniform. "You're the smartest person I know. You know about stars and math and how birds fly, and..." "David." She pulled back gently, looking into his eyes. "Listen to me. You can't control how other people see you. You can only control what you give to the world. And what I give to you, our lessons, our talks, our time together, that's real. Nobody can take that away, no matter what they say." He sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "When Dad comes home, he'll see. He'll know you're not just a nanny." Mirabel smiled sadly. Richard Robinson. She'd barely spoken 10 words to the man in 3 years. He was always traveling, always in meetings, always somewhere else. To him, she was even more invisible than she was to his wife, just a line item on the household budget. "Maybe," she said softly. "But even if he doesn't, we know. That's what matters." She walked him back upstairs, tucked him into bed, and sang him a lullaby in her native language, a song her mother had sung to her. David's eyes grew heavy, his breathing deepened, and finally he slept. Mirabel stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him. Then she retreated to her own small room at the back of the house, the servants' quarters where she was allowed to exist on her own terms. She sat at her narrow desk and pulled out her old engineering notebook from its hiding place in the closet. The pages were worn, the equations familiar. She ran her fingers over calculations she'd made years ago, formulas for load-bearing structures, stress analyses for bridges. Another life. Another version of herself. Tomorrow she would wake up and be invisible again. She would serve breakfast, drive David to school, clean the mansion, prepare dinner. She would exist in the margins. But tonight, for just a moment, she let herself remember who she'd been before poverty and circumstances had forced her into someone else's shadow. A tear fell onto the page, blurring the ink. She closed the notebook and placed it back in the closet. Somewhere, 3,000 miles away, Richard Robinson was closing $1 billion deal. In Singapore, Richard Robinson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of a skyscraper boardroom, the city sprawling beneath him like a circuit board of lights. The deal was done. Papers signed. Handshakes exchanged. Another acquisition, another quarter of growth, another line on the portfolio that proved his genius. His phone buzzed. A message from Rachel. Dinner party was perfect. Everyone loved the house. Don't rush back. He stared at the message. When had he started feeling like a stranger in his own life? The deals that once thrilled him now felt hollow. The victories tasted like ash. Success after success, achievement after achievement, and somewhere along the way, he'd lost the ability to feel any of it. Another message came through, this one a photo, Rachel and her friends around the dining table, crystal glasses raised, smiles dazzling. His beautiful wife in her beautiful home with her beautiful people. It looked like a magazine spread. It looked perfect. It looked nothing like a home. He thought of his son. When had he last had a real conversation with David? Last week's phone call had been brief, distracted. David had tried to tell him something about a lesson or a teacher, but Richard had been reviewing contracts, half listening. "That's great, buddy. Listen, Dad has to go. We'll talk more when I'm home." Home. When was he ever home? Richard turned from the window. His CFO was packing up, chattering about tomorrow's meetings. The hotel suite waiting for him was luxurious and empty. He could sleep for a few hours, wake up, do it all again. Fly to London next, then New York, then back here. The circuit of success, the treadmill of achievement. Actually, Richard heard himself say, cancel tomorrow's meetings. His CFO looked up, startled. "Sir." "All of them. I'm going home." "But the contracts can wait." Richard was already pulling out his phone, texting his pilot. "I'm going home early." Something in David's voice from that last call nagged at him. a sadness underneath the words. Something about dinner, about his mom's friends. Richard had dismissed it, too caught up in his own world to pay attention. But now, standing in this sterile boardroom after another empty victory, he felt a pull he couldn't name. His son needed him. Maybe he'd always needed him, and Richard had just been too absent to notice. 2 hours later, Richard Robinson's private jet lifted off into the night sky, carrying him home to a house he barely recognized anymore, to a wife who'd become a stranger, to a son he'd neglected for too long. He didn't know what he'd find when he arrived. He didn't know that in 2 days, when he walked through those mahogany doors earlier than expected, his entire world would shatter and rebuild itself in the space of a single frozen moment. He didn't know that the woman his wife had mocked, the woman he'd never truly seen, was about to change everything. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he was choosing to go home. And sometimes, that's where transformation begins, with a single choice to finally show up. The jet climbed higher, cutting through clouds, carrying him toward a truth he wasn't ready for but desperately needed. Before we continue this story, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of seeing the overlooked, take a moment to reflect. Who in your life deserves to be truly seen? Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look twice. The private jet touched down just after 11 p.m., wheels kissing the tarmac with a whisper that seemed too quiet for the weight Richard carried. He'd spent the entire flight staring at clouds, at his reflection in the oval window, at the contracts he couldn't focus on. That nagging feeling, the one that had started as a whisper and grown into a shout, refused to let him rest. His driver met him at the private terminal, professional and silent as always. Richard climbed into the back seat of the town car, watching the city lights blur past as they drove through empty streets toward the estate. He should have been exhausted. Should have wanted nothing more than his bed and 8 hours of oblivion. Instead, he felt wired, alert, pulled forward by something he couldn't name. "Welcome home, Mr. Robinson," the driver said as they pulled through the iron gates. Home. The word felt foreign. The mansion rose before them, imposing and elegant against the night sky. But something was off. Richard leaned forward, frowning. Lights were on, not the usual soft glow of nighttime security lighting, but real illumination. The study window on the first floor glowed warm and golden, and as the car rounded the circular drive, Richard could swear he saw movement behind the curtains. "That's strange," the driver murmured. "I thought Mrs. Robinson would be asleep by now." So had Richard. Rachel retired early religiously, her beauty sleep as scheduled and unchangeable as everything else in her life. And David should have been asleep hours ago. The car stopped. Richard stepped out, his Italian leather shoes crunching on the gravel. He waved the driver off, he'd get his own luggage later, and stood alone in the darkness, staring up at his house. At this building he'd bought, paid for, owned, but somehow never inhabited. Not really. The front door was unlocked. He stepped inside, and the familiar scent of the mansion washed over him. Expensive candles, furniture polish, the faint trace of Rachel's perfume. The marble floor gleamed under his feet, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. Everything was exactly as it always was, perfect, pristine, empty. But then he heard it. Voices. Soft and indistinct, coming from the study. Richard set down his briefcase silently, his exhaustion forgotten. Who would be awake at this hour? He moved toward the sound, his footsteps unconsciously quieting. As he drew closer, the voices separated into two distinct tones, one young and eager, one gentle and patient. David. And someone else. Not Rachel. Rachel's voice was sharp even when soft, performative even in private. This voice was different. Warm. Real. Richard approached the study door, which stood slightly ajar, golden light spilling across the hallway floor. He paused just outside, something holding him back. The rational part of his brain told him to simply walk in, but instinct, or perhaps something deeper, made him stop and listen. "So if we know the angle here is 90 degrees, the woman's voice was saying, and this side is 5 units, what can we figure out about this side? We can use that triangle thing." David's voice, bright with excitement. The one with the weird name. Pythagorean theorem. Exactly right, David. You're getting so good at this. It's like a puzzle. But with numbers. That's exactly what it is. Mathematics isn't just about memorizing formulas, sweetheart. It's about seeing patterns. It's about understanding how beauty and logic work together. The universe speaks in numbers, and once you learn the language, you can understand anything. Richard's hand froze on the doorknob. That voice. He knew it, and yet he didn't. It was familiar in the way furniture is familiar, present but unnoticed. The woman who'd worked in his house for 3 years, whose name he knew but whose voice he'd never truly heard until this moment. Mirabel. He pushed the door open slowly, and the scene before him struck him with such force that he literally stopped breathing. The study, his study, the room where he reviewed contracts and made phone calls and lived his other life, had been transformed. The heavy desk was pushed to the side. In the center of the room, a large whiteboard stood covered in geometric proofs, equations, and diagrams that Richard recognized from his own university days. Advanced mathematics. Not elementary school homework, but real, complex, beautiful mathematics. Mirabel stood at the whiteboard, a marker in her hand, her simple gray uniform somehow not looking out of place in this scene of intellectual pursuit. Her hair had come slightly loose from its usual neat bun, and there was an energy about her, a light, a confidence, that Richard had never seen before. And David. His 6-year-old son sat cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by books and papers and colored pencils, his notebook open in his lap. But it was the expression on his face that stopped Richard's heart. Pure concentration. Complete engagement. The kind of focus Richard had been trying to buy with expensive tutors and elite schools and never once achieved. David was looking at Mirabel the way Richard imagined people once looked at Socrates, at Da Vinci, at anyone who opened their eyes to the world's hidden wonders. See David. Mirabel was saying, her marker moving gracefully across the board. This triangle shows up everywhere. In architecture, in art, in nature. The Egyptians used it to build the pyramids. Modern engineers use it to build bridges. Once you understand the relationship between these sides, you understand something fundamental about the world. Like a secret code, David breathed. Exactly like a secret code. The chandelier above cast warm golden light over the scene, and papers were scattered everywhere. David's drawings of rockets and buildings mixed with mathematical notations, a child's imagination meeting rigorous logic. Books lay open, showing diagrams and formulas. A plate with crumbs suggested they'd been at this for hours, sharing snacks and knowledge in equal measure. This wasn't random homework help. This wasn't a nanny killing time. This was real teaching. This was passion and purpose and love made manifest. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth slightly open, unable to process what he was seeing. How had this been happening in his house? How had he never known? How had he walked past this woman for 3 years and never seen her? Mirabel turned slightly, still talking, and her eyes landed on Richard. The marker fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. The color drained from her face. Mr. Robinson. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. I didn't expect you home so early. David's head whipped around, and his face split into a brilliant smile. Dad. He scrambled to his feet, running toward Richard. You're home. Look what Miss Mirabel taught me. He grabbed Richard's hand, pulling him into the room. We're learning about triangles and how they help build things, and Dad, it's so cool. Richard allowed himself to be pulled forward, but his eyes remained locked on Mirabel. She stood frozen, her confidence evaporating like morning dew. Her shoulders hunched slightly, her gaze dropping to the floor, her whole body language shifting from teacher to servant in the space of a heartbeat. What's going on here? Richard asked, his voice steadier than he felt. His mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the woman he'd just watched teaching with the invisible figure who'd existed in the margins of his home. I'm sorry, sir, Mirabel stammered, her hands twisting together. I didn't mean to overstep. David found one of my old notebooks and he was curious about the equations, and I should have asked permission first. I know it's not my place to. Old notebook. Richard interrupted, moving closer to the whiteboard. The equations stared back at him, complex and precise. University-level mathematics. Graduate-level, even. Yes, sir, Mirabel whispered, her cheeks flushing with shame. Or perhaps fear. I used to study engineering. Before life. Her voice trailed off into silence. The unfinished sentence hung in the air like smoke. Richard studied the whiteboard, his mind racing. The proofs were flawless. The The teaching methodology was sophisticated, building from basic concepts to complex applications, mixing theory with real-world examples. This wasn't someone who dabbled in mathematics. This was someone who'd lived it, loved it, breathed it. He turned to look at Mirabel, really look at her, perhaps for the first time in 3 years. She stood with her eyes downcast, her body language screaming apology, but he could see traces of the woman who'd been teaching moments ago. The intelligence in her eyes. The passion barely contained. "David," Richard said quietly. "It's late. Go to bed." "But Dad." "Now please." David's face fell. He looked between his father and Mirabel, suddenly afraid. "Miss Mirabel's not in trouble, is she?" "We'll talk in the morning. Go on." David moved reluctantly toward the door, casting a worried backward glance at Mirabel. She gave him a small, reassuring smile that didn't reach her eyes. The boy's footsteps faded up the stairs, and then Richard and Mirabel were alone. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Mirabel remained frozen, waiting for judgment, for anger, for termination. Richard could see it in every line of her body, the expectation of punishment for daring to be more than she was supposed to be. "How long has this been going on?" Richard asked finally. 3 months, sir." Her voice was barely audible. "It started when David found my old textbook. He asked me about the diagrams, and I explained a little, and he wanted to know more, so I—" She swallowed hard. "I'm truly sorry. I know I should have asked Mrs. Robinson for permission, but she was away and David was so curious and I didn't think. You used to study engineering." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Where?" "Universidad Nacional. Back home." Her accent thickened slightly with emotion. "I was 3 months from graduation when my father died." Richard moved closer, studying the equations again. "And you ended up here." "Medical debt." The words came out mechanical, rehearsed from years of explaining. "My father needed surgery. The costs. My mother had 3 younger children to care for. I had to find work immediately. A teaching degree takes years. This." She gestured helplessly at her uniform. "This paid enough to send money home." Richard felt something crack in his chest. "And you've been here 3 years." "Yes, sir." "Invisible." The word came out harsher than he intended, but Mirabel flinched as if struck. Her silence was answer enough. "My wife mocked you at dinner last week." Again, not a question. David had mentioned something on the phone, something Richard had been too distracted to pursue. Mirabel's jaw tightened. "It's not my place to comment on." "She did, though, didn't she?" A long pause. Then barely whispered, "Yes, sir." Richard turned away from the whiteboard, looking at this woman, really seeing her for the first time. "When I walked through that door just now, do you know what I saw?" Mirabel shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I saw my son more engaged than I've ever seen him. I saw teaching that would put most university professors to shame. I saw someone who's been in my house for 3 years, and I realized with absolute horror that I've never seen you before." "Not really." His voice cracked. "Not a nanny overstepping boundaries. Someone loving my son." Tears welled in Mirabel's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Tell me about the dinner party," Richard said quietly. "All of it. Mr. Robinson, please. Tell me." So she did. Quietly, without embellishment or self-pity, she told him about the questions, about David's innocent interruption, about Rachel's dismissive laughter and cutting words, about the mockery from the guests, the casual cruelty of people who'd never questioned their right to diminish others, about David's attempt to defend her and Rachel's cold dismissal, about cleaning up afterward while the echo of laughter still haunted the rooms. With each word, Richard felt his carefully constructed world fracturing. He thought of Rachel's message from Singapore, dinner party was perfect, and wanted to laugh at the bitter irony. Perfect for whom? And afterward, he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. David came downstairs. He was crying. He apologized for his mother's behavior. Mirabel's voice broke slightly. A 6-year-old child apologizing for his mother's cruelty. I held him and told him it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't control how others saw me. That what mattered was what we gave to the world, not how the world judged us. Richard turned back to the whiteboard, seeing it through new eyes. All of this, the equations, the teaching, the hours of patient mentorship, was what this woman gave to the world. Given freely, without recognition, to a child who saw her worth when no one else did. "I've built empires," Richard said quietly, more to himself than to Mirabel. "I've closed billion-dollar deals. I've won awards and accolades and the respect of every corporate vulture in this city. But I couldn't see the treasure in my own house. I walked past brilliance every single day, too blind to notice." "Mr. Robinson, I'm not firing you." The words came out firm, decisive. "I'm not even close to firing you." Mirabel's head snapped up, confusion and hope warring on her face. Richard looked at her, this woman who'd been reduced to furniture in her own life, who'd buried her dreams to save her family, who'd still found enough generosity in her heart to teach his neglected son in secret. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet. But I know it's not that." A tear slipped down Mirabel's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, that trained invisibility reasserting itself. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me." Richard's voice was rough with emotion. Not for the bare minimum of human decency. He stood there in his study, surrounded by evidence of what he'd been missing, what he'd been too absent to see. The whiteboard. The books. The scattered papers showing a child's mind blooming under careful cultivation. And at the center of it all, a woman who'd been told she was nothing, treated like furniture, mocked at dinner parties, and still chose to give. Richard Robinson had spent 3 years living in this house without ever being home. Had spent 6 years with a son he barely knew. Had built an empire but failed at being human. Standing in that golden-lit study at midnight, watching tears slide silently down Mirabel's face while she tried to hide them, Richard felt something inside him shift. Break open. Transform. "Tell me about engineering," he said quietly. "Tell me what you were going to build." Mirabel looked up, startled. "Sir. Your degree. What was your focus? What did you dream about building?" For a moment she hesitated, caught between the woman who'd just been teaching and the servant expected to remain silent. Then slowly, the light came back into her eyes. "Bridges," she whispered. "And schools. Infrastructure for villages like mine. Places where children grow up without access to education because there's no road, no building, no foundation." Her voice grew stronger. "I wanted to design structures that would last generations. That would connect people to opportunities they never had before." Richard stared at the whiteboard, at this woman, at the future he'd almost let slip past unnoticed. "We have a lot to talk about," he said finally. "But not tonight. It's late." Mirabel nodded, moving to clean up the study, to erase the board, to return everything to its proper invisible place. "Leave it," Richard said. She froze, marker in hand. "Leave it all exactly as it is. I want to see it in the morning. I want to remember what I almost missed." Mirabel set down the marker carefully. She moved toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Robinson? Thank you for listening." After she left, Richard stood alone in the study. He approached the whiteboard, running his fingers over the equations, the careful diagrams, the evidence of brilliance hidden in plain sight. His hand came away marked with chalk dust, and he stared at it like he'd never seen his own palm before. Then slowly, Richard Robinson, billionaire, empire builder, absent father, sank into the chair and buried his face in his hands. Silent tears fell, each one a year of blindness, a moment of failure, a child's neglected questions, a brilliant mind dismissed and overlooked. He cried for what he'd almost never seen. For the woman who'd been invisible. For the son he'd abandoned to nannies and tutors while searching for meaning in boardrooms. For the marriage that had died years ago but kept moving like a corpse pretending at life. And when he finally lifted his head and looked again at that whiteboard covered in another person's deferred dreams, Richard made a decision. Whatever came next, whatever battles he'd have to fight, whatever costs he'd have to pay, he would never be blind again. The question wasn't whether Mirabel deserved better. The question was whether he deserved the chance to do better. He wasn't sure of the answer. But for the first time in years, he was going to try to find out. Richard lay in the darkness of the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling as shadows from the security lights outside played across the crown molding. Beside him, Rachel slept the peaceful sleep of someone unburdened by conscience, her breathing deep and regular, her silk sleep mask blocking out the world. He turned his head slightly, studying her profile in the dim light. She was beautiful, objectively, undeniably beautiful. Her skin flawless even without makeup, her features perfectly proportioned, her body maintained through rigorous Pilates and the kind of discipline that came from treating life as a constant performance. But looking at her now, really looking, Richard saw something he'd been avoiding for years. She was a stranger. Beautiful, cold, distant. A woman he'd married for reasons that had made sense at the time. Compatible social circles, shared ambitions, the merger of two powerful families, but had nothing to do with love. When had he last felt warmth from her? When had they last had a conversation that mattered? He closed his eyes, but sleep was impossible. Images cycled through his mind like a slideshow he couldn't stop. David's face, lit with wonder as he looked at Mirabel. The pure engagement, the hunger to learn, the trust. When had his son ever looked at him that way? Rachel's laughter at the dinner party, David had mentioned it, and Mirabel had confirmed it. That casual, cutting cruelty that came so easily to people who'd never questioned their right to diminish others. Mirabel's trembling hands holding the water pitcher. The way she'd forced a smile, swallowed her dignity, made herself invisible while laughter echoed around her. His own absence. Years of business trips and phone calls and empty promises. "I'll be home soon, buddy. Dad just has one more meeting. We'll spend time together when this deal closes." Except the deals never really closed. There was always another merger, another acquisition, another boardroom to conquer. He'd built an empire. Billions in assets. Properties on 3 continents. A name that commanded respect in every major financial center. And somewhere along the way, he'd lost everything that actually mattered. Richard sat up carefully, not wanting to wake Rachel, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The clock read 3:17 a.m. He pulled on his robe and slipped out of the room, his bare feet silent on the thick carpet. The mansion was dark and quiet, lit only by the soft glow of night lights in the hallways. Richard walked through rooms he'd paid for but never truly inhabited. The formal living room with its imported furniture that no one ever sat on. The dining room where Rachel hosted her performances. The library filled with leather-bound books no one ever read, purchased by the yard to look impressive. Every room a monument to wealth without warmth. Beautiful, perfect, empty. He ended up in the study, standing before the whiteboard he'd told Mirabel to leave untouched. In the darkness, he could just make out the equations, the careful diagrams, the evidence of passion and brilliance that had been hiding in his house for 3 years. 3 years. Richard sank into his desk chair and buried his face in his hands. In the small room at the back of the mansion, Mirabel sat at her narrow desk, her hands shaking as she stared at the few belongings she'd already packed into her worn suitcase. The room was sparse, a narrow bed, a small closet, a desk barely large enough for a laptop, a single window that looked out onto the service alley. This had been her world for 3 years. She'd known this day would come eventually. Known that her invisibility would fail, that she'd overstep some invisible boundary, that she'd be cast out. She just hadn't expected it to hurt quite this much. Her old engineering notebook lay open on the desk, and she traced the equations with trembling fingers. Formulas for load-bearing calculations. Stress analyses for bridge designs. The careful notations of a younger version of herself, a girl who'd believed she could change the world. The memory came unbidden, sharp and painful despite the years. Mirabel. Her father's voice, warm with pride. "Top of your class again. My brilliant daughter, the engineer." She'd been 23, 3 months from graduation, her final thesis nearly complete. A design for a pedestrian bridge that could be built cheaply using local materials, connecting her village to the school 2 kilometers away. No more children walking through dangerous terrain. No more families isolated during rainy season. "I'm going to build it for you, Papa," she told him. "For our village. For everyone." Her father had hugged her tight. "You already have, Mija. You've built a future." 2 weeks later, he collapsed in the fields. Heart attack. By the time they got him to the hospital in the city, it was too late. Then came the bills. The medical debt. The funeral costs. The reality that her mother had 3 younger children to feed and no income. The university had been sympathetic but firm. Without tuition payment, she couldn't continue. Her professors had tried to help, writing recommendation letters, reaching out to scholarship programs. But scholarships took time, and her family was drowning. 6 months later, she'd boarded a plane to a foreign country, leaving behind her degree, her dreams, and her identity. Becoming invisible. Becoming whatever she needed to be to send money home. Mirabel returned to the present, tears blurring the equations on the page. She wiped her eyes angrily. Crying wouldn't change anything. Self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write, her handwriting careful and precise. Dear David, if you're reading this, it means I've had to leave. I want you to know that teaching you has been the greatest joy of my life. You are brilliant, kind, and curious. Never lose those qualities. Remember what I told you, mathematics isn't just about numbers. It's about seeing patterns in the world. Keep looking for those patterns. Keep asking questions. Never stop being curious. And David, please remember, you cannot control how others see you. You can only control what you give to the world. Give kindness. Give effort. Give love. Your father came home early tonight, and I hope, he finally sees you. Really sees you. That's all I ever wanted. Stay curious. Stay kind. With love, Miss Mirabel. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope with David's name on it. Then she laid her head on the desk, next to her old notebook, and let exhaustion claim her. Tears dried on the pages of her deferred dreams. Dawn broke cold and gray, light seeping through the windows like an unwelcome guest. Rachel woke at precisely 6:30 a.m. as always, her internal clock as reliable as everything else about her carefully controlled life. She reached across the bed and found it empty, the sheets cool. Frowning, she removed her sleep mask and sat up. Richard was already awake? That was unusual. He typically slept until 7, then went straight to his morning workout. Routine was important to Rachel. Deviation suggested chaos. She found him in the study, still in his robe, standing before the whiteboard. He hadn't moved, hadn't changed, hadn't done anything but stare at equations she couldn't begin to understand. Richard. Her voice carried an edge of irritation. What are you doing? And what is all this mess? He didn't turn around. When did you mock Mirabel at dinner? Rachel's frown deepened. What? The dinner party. Last week. When did you mock her? Oh, that. Rachel waved a dismissive hand, moving into the room. She was getting above her station, Richard. Someone needed to remind her of her place. You know how staff can be if you let them. She has a degree. Richard's voice was quiet, controlled in a way that made Rachel pause. Almost. Engineering. Rachel laughed, the sound bright and dismissive. She's a nanny, Richard. Don't be ridiculous. I'm sure she told you some sob story, but really. She was 3 months from graduation. Richard turned, and Rachel took an involuntary step back. Something in his eyes was different. Something she'd never seen before in their years of polite, distant marriage. Top of her class. Designing bridges. Then her father died and medical debt forced her to leave. She's been in our house for 3 years, sending every penny home to support her family. And you mocked her. In front of guests. For teaching our son. I was putting her in her place, Rachel said, her voice hardening. Class exists for a reason, Richard. Servants are servants. If you blur those lines, everything falls apart. Class is destiny. Richard's laugh was bitter. Servants are furniture. They're staff. They work for us. That's the arrangement. Rachel crossed her arms, her patience wearing thin. I don't understand what's gotten into you. Did you hit your head on the plane? I've been blind. Richard's voice cracked. We've been cruel. No, you've been cruel, and I've been absent enough to let it happen. Rachel's eyes flashed. Don't you dare judge me. I've maintained this household, raised our son, represented our family in society while you've been off playing businessman. I've done everything expected of me. You've treated a brilliant woman like furniture. You've mocked her for daring to be more than you decided she should be. And our son, our 6-year-old son, felt the need to apologize to her for your behavior. He was being inappropriate. He was being human. Richard's voice rose for the first time. He was showing kindness to someone who's shown him nothing but patience and care. Something we should have been doing all along. Rachel stared at him, genuinely confused. In her worldview, there was no moral dimension to this situation. There were employers and employees, correct behavior and incorrect behavior. Sentiment didn't factor into it. "You're being absurd," she said finally, her tone dismissive. "I have a spa appointment. We'll discuss this when you're being rational." She turned and walked out, her silk robe floating behind her like a cape. Richard stood alone in the study, staring at the space where she'd been, feeling the final threads of their marriage dissolve like smoke. His decision crystallized. Whatever came next, it wouldn't involve pretending anymore. Mirabel stood in the kitchen, mechanically preparing breakfast. Toast, eggs, fresh fruit, the same routine she'd performed 1,000 times. But her hands shook, and twice she nearly dropped plates. She couldn't meet her own eyes in the reflection of the stainless steel appliances. This was it. Today was the day. Mr. Robinson would call her into his study and terminate her employment. Kindly, probably, he seemed like a kind man, which somehow made it worse. She'd pack her things, return to a country where her incomplete degree meant nothing, and figure out how to support her family from scratch. Mirabel. She jumped, nearly dropping the egg she was cracking. Richard stood in the doorway, still in his robe, looking exhausted but somehow more present than she'd ever seen him. "Sir, breakfast will be ready in." "Sit down, please." It wasn't a command. It was a request. Mirabel's training told her to refuse, to maintain proper boundaries, but something in his voice made her obey. She wiped her hands on a towel and sat stiffly at the kitchen table, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. Richard sat across from her, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. "Tell me about your studies," Richard said finally. "Before your father died. What were you working on?" Mirabel blinked, confused. This wasn't how terminations went. "Sir, I don't think." "Please. I want to know." So she told him. Haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. About her thesis on affordable bridge design. About infrastructure serving humanity, connecting isolated communities to opportunities. About dreams of building schools in villages like hers, creating foundations that would last generations. As she spoke, her whole demeanor changed. Her eyes lit up. Her hands moved, sketching invisible structures in the air. The careful mask of the servant fell away, and Richard saw the scholar she'd been meant to be. "You talk about engineering like poetry," he said quietly. "It is poetry." Mirabel smiled despite herself. "It's taking raw materials and creating something that serves people. Every calculation, every measurement, every choice in design, it all matters. A bridge isn't just concrete and steel. It's connection. It's possibility." Richard watched her, seeing not a nanny but a visionary. Someone who'd had everything taken from her but still found ways to give. The kitchen door swung open and David rushed in, still in his pajamas. He stopped when he saw them sitting together, his face crumpling with worry. "Miss Mirabel." He ran to her side, pressing against her. "Are you in trouble? Because of me?" "No, sweetheart," she said automatically, wrapping an arm around him. "Everything's okay." Richard watched them, the boy clinging to her, the woman comforting him despite her own fear. Their bond was real, built over years of small moments, patient teaching, genuine care. Everything his relationship with his son wasn't. "Mirabel," Richard said, his voice firm. "Pack your things." The color drained from her face. David let out a small cry. Mirabel nodded stiffly, tears burning behind her eyes. "I understand, sir. Thank you for..." "You're enrolling in university," Richard continued. "Full scholarship. Through my foundation. You'll complete your degree." Mirabel's mouth fell open. "I what?" "And you'll continue with David. As his official educator. Not his nanny. His teacher. At triple your current salary." "Sir, I can't possibly," Mirabel's voice broke. "I don't understand." "Really, Dad?" David's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "Really? Miss Mirabel can stay." She's not just staying, Richard said, looking directly at Mirabel. She's becoming who she was always meant to be. And David is going to learn from someone who actually sees him. Tears spilled down Mirabel's cheeks. She tried to speak but couldn't form words, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her mouth. I don't deserve this, she finally whispered. You deserve more than I could ever give you, Richard said quietly. But it's a start. David threw his arms around Mirabel, laughing and crying at the same time. She held him tight, her own tears falling onto his hair. Richard. The voice was ice. Rachel stood in the doorway, dressed for her spa appointment in expensive athleisure, her face a mask of barely contained fury. We need to talk. Now. Richard stood slowly, meeting his wife's eyes. For the first time in their marriage, he didn't flinch. Rachel made the first call before she'd even reached the master bedroom. Patricia? Yes, it's Rachel Robinson. I need you to hear this from me before the gossip starts. By lunchtime, the phones were ringing. Richard sat in his home office, watching his cell light up with incoming calls. Board members. Business partners. Social acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in months, suddenly concerned about his well-being. Richard, it's Gerald Mitchell. Got a disturbing call from Rachel. Is it true you're letting the nanny teach your boy? Seems irregular. Richard, darling, it's Patricia Hartwell. I'm concerned about what I'm hearing. Blurring lines with staff is never wise. Mr. Robinson, this is Douglas Chun from the Investment Consortium. We need to discuss some concerns about your recent judgment. Each call was different, but the message was the same. You're making us uncomfortable. You're breaking the rules. You're making mistakes that reflect poorly on all of us. By afternoon, the first headline appeared on a gossip website: Billionaire's controversial household decision, society shocked by Nanny's elevated role. Within hours, it spread. Social media picked it up, twisted it, amplified it. Paparazzi appeared at the gates, cameras ready to catch scandal. The story had everything: wealth, class conflict, unconventional choices. It was irresistible. Richard stood at the window, watching photographers position themselves outside the estate walls. His phone continued buzzing with messages ranging from concerned to mocking to threatening. The call from David's school principal came late afternoon. Mr. Robinson, I'm calling to discuss some concerns about David's home environment. Several board members have reached out with questions about stability, and we need to ensure. David is fine, Richard interrupted. Better than fine. He's thriving. Yes, well, his unconventional educational arrangement has raised questions about whether I'm fit to make decisions about my own son? A pause. I didn't say that, Mr. Robinson. But we must consider what's in David's best interests. Richard ended the call, his jaw tight. The walls were closing in. Rachel had mobilized her army quickly and efficiently, turning his entire social and professional world against him. An email arrived from his lead investor: Richard, we need to discuss your recent behavior. The board has concerns about your stability and judgment. Let's schedule a call. The pressure mounted from every direction, a coordinated assault designed to force compliance. Fall back in line. Remember your place. Remember the rules. Mirabel stood in front of the television in the staff lounge, her face pale as she watched news coverage of the mansion gates, photographers swarming. The cheerin read, Billionaire causes scandal with household staff. Her hands shook. This was exactly what she'd feared. Not termination, something worse. She'd become a weapon used against Richard, against David. Her presence was destroying their lives. She found Richard in his office, staring at his laptop screen filled with hostile emails. Mr. Robinson, she said quietly from the doorway. I need to speak with you. He looked up, and she saw exhaustion in his eyes. One day. It had been one day since his offer, and the world had already turned against him. I should leave, Mirabel said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I'm causing problems. Terrible problems. If I just go quietly, all of this will stop. No. Please, sir. Look what's happening. Your reputation, your business, your marriage. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to disrupt your family. Richard stood, moving around the desk toward her. Mirabel, my family was disrupted long before you. It's been disrupted for years. I was just too blind to see it. But the news, the phone calls, the pressure. They're showing their true colors, not yours. Every person calling to express concern about appropriate boundaries is really just upset that I'm breaking their comfortable rules. That I'm seeing someone they've trained themselves not to see. Mirabel's eyes filled with tears. I can't be responsible for destroying your life. You're not destroying anything. You're helping me see what was already broken. Richard ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking older than his years. Do you want to know the truth about my marriage? Rachel and I married for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Social compatibility. Family connections. It was a merger, not a relationship. We've been pretending for years, and the only person who's suffered is David. Mirabel looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the confession. Sir, I shouldn't. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I just want you to know this isn't your fault. None of it. Rachel and I would have ended up here eventually. You just forced me to finally see clearly. The study door burst open. David ran in, his face streaked with tears, his school uniform disheveled. Dad. There are people with cameras outside. They took my picture and asked me weird questions and... Mirabel dropped to her knees instantly, opening her arms. David crashed into her, sobbing against her shoulder. She held him, stroking his hair, murmuring soft reassurances in her native language. Richard watched them, and something inside him settled. This was what family looked like. Not performance, not social climbing, not carefully maintained appearances. Just genuine care, freely given. It's okay, sweetheart, Mirabel whispered. You're safe. We're right here. Why are they being so mean? David's voice was muffled against her shoulder. Why do they care if you teach me? Because people fear what they don't understand, Mirabel said gently. And they don't understand that worth isn't measured by job titles. David pulled back, looking up at his father. You're not going to let them make her leave, are you? Richard knelt beside them both, his hand on his son's shoulder. No, buddy. I'm not. Whatever happens, we're doing this right. The intervention was scheduled for that evening. Rachel had moved quickly, assembling her allies in the formal sitting room, the one reserved for important occasions, with its uncomfortable antique furniture and intimidating portraits of previous generations. Richard descended the stairs at 7 p.m. to find 12 people waiting for him. His business partners. Rachel's social circle. The patriarch of his father's old firm. All seated in a semicircle like a tribunal, with Rachel at the center, her face a mask of concerned composure. Richard, thank you for joining us, Gerald Mitchell began, his tone patronizing. We're here because we care about you. About your family. About your judgment. Richard remained standing, looking at each face in turn. People he'd known for years. People he'd made money with, socialized with, trusted with his business dealings. Now they sat in judgment because he dared to break their unspoken rules. Your recent behavior has been concerning, Pa. Patricia Hartwell said delicately. This business with the nanny. Her name is Mirabel, Richard interrupted. Yes, well. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Regardless, you're embarrassing yourself. Embarrassing the family name. People are talking. Let them talk. Richard, be reasonable, his business partner Marcus Chun interjected. Investors are nervous about your stability. Your judgment. This looks like an impulsive decision, possibly a breakdown. Or possibly, Richard said quietly, I finally woke up. The room fell silent. Rachel's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're throwing away everything for what? The patriarch, Harold Whitmore, spoke from his position of authority. For some romantic notion about a servant? You're making yourself look unstable. Unfit. Unfit, Richard repeated, tasting the word. He looked at Rachel. Is that the narrative you're building? That I'm unstable? Rachel's face remained composed, but something flickered in her eyes. Richard, I've consulted with lawyers. If you continue this madness, I'll have no choice but to pursue custody of David. For his protection. I'll have testimony that you've created an inappropriate environment, that your judgment is compromised. That I finally started paying attention to my son? Richard's voice remained quiet, but something in it made several people shift uncomfortably. That I finally recognized brilliance that's been in my house for 3 years? That I stopped prioritizing appearances over actual humanity? He turned to address the full room, this collection of wealthy, powerful people who'd gathered to force him back into line. I've spent decades chasing the wrong things, Richard said. Building empires, accumulating wealth, winning respect from people who measure worth in dollar signs and social connections. And you know what I realized 3 nights ago, when I came home and found my son learning from someone you're all dismissing as just the help? He paused, meeting each gaze in turn. That woman you're all so concerned about, the one you think is beneath me, beneath us, beneath whatever arbitrary line you've drawn, taught my son more about life, about wonder, about genuine curiosity and kindness in 3 months than I managed in 6 years. She did that while sending every penny she earned to support her family. While being mocked at dinner parties. While being treated like furniture. Richard, Rachel's voice carried a warning. If that makes me unfit, so be it. If recognizing her worth makes me unstable, I'll wear that label proudly. Because I'd rather be unfit by your standards than blind by my own. The room erupted. Multiple people spoke at once, voices raised in protest, concern, anger. Rachel stood, her face flushed, her carefully maintained composure cracking. Richard didn't wait to hear more. He turned and walked out of his own intervention, out of the sitting room where people who'd never questioned their privilege sat in judgment of something they'd never understand. He found Mirabel and David in the study, their safe place, sitting on the floor with books spread around them. They looked up as he entered, fear and hope warring on both faces. Whatever happens, Richard said, closing the door behind him, we're doing this right. Behind him, in the sitting room, Rachel stood surrounded by her allies, her face a mask of calculation. She'd lost this round, but the war was far from over. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a plan was already forming. If Richard wanted to fight, she'd show him exactly what she was capable of. 3 weeks passed in a state of Cold War. Rachel moved her belongings to the guest suite on the opposite wing of the mansion, her absence from the master bedroom a silent declaration. They communicated through lawyers now, through terse text messages, through the glacial politeness of 2 strangers forced to share space. The mansion felt even larger than before, rooms echoing with unsaid words and unresolved battles. The outside pressure continued relentlessly. Reporters still lingered at the gates, hoping for a photo, a quote, any scrap to feed the scandal. Richard's social circle had fractured, some standing by him quietly, most maintaining careful distance. Invitations stopped arriving. Business lunches were politely rescheduled and never rebooked. David bore it with the confused resilience of childhood, but Richard saw the toll. Kids at school asked questions their parents had planted. Is it true your nanny is really smart? My mom says your dad is making weird choices. Some teasing, some genuine curiosity, all of it forcing David to defend a situation he didn't fully understand. But inside the mansion, in the spaces Rachel didn't inhabit, something else was growing. Mirabel had enrolled in the night engineering program at the university, her days now split between teaching David and attending her own classes. She'd arrive home near midnight, exhausted, and study until 2 or 3 in the morning, her small desk lamp burning like a beacon of determination. Richard found himself working from home more, scheduling meetings around David's lessons. He'd sit in the corner of the study, ostensibly reviewing contracts, but really watching his son engage with mathematics, with science, with ideas that sparked his imagination. There were beautiful moments in those 3 weeks. The 3 of them bent over a physics problem, David asking questions, Mirabel explaining with patient enthusiasm, Richard contributing what he remembered from his own education. Laughter. Genuine connection. The kind of family life Richard had never known was possible. Sometimes he'd catch Rachel watching from doorways, her expression unreadable. Not angry anymore, exactly. Something else. Calculation, perhaps. Or resignation. She'd stand there for a moment, then drift away like a ghost haunting her own home. Mirabel grew thinner, dark circles appearing under her eyes from the exhaustion of her triple life. Teacher, student, woman caught in the crossfire of a marriage's collapse. But there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Purpose. Hope. The gradual unfurling of a self that had been compressed for too long. Richard was transforming too. Softer. Present. Engaged. His business partners noted his changed priorities, his refusal to travel unnecessarily, his insistence on being home for dinner. Some worried about his focus. Others, quietly, respected it. But underneath it all, Richard felt the pressure building. This couldn't last forever. Something would have to break. The letter arrived on a Thursday evening, international postage, the envelope thin and worn from its journey. Mirabel collected the mail as she always did, sorting through bills and advertisements. Then she froze, her hand trembling as she recognized the handwriting. Richard was in the kitchen making tea when he heard the sound, something between a gasp and a sob. He turned to find Mirabel standing in the doorway, clutching an opened letter, her face drained of color. Mirabel. He set down the kettle immediately. What's wrong? She couldn't speak, just stood there with tears streaming down her face, the letter shaking in her hands. Richard guided her to a chair, sat across from her, and waited. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught him the power of patient silence. It's my mother. The words came out broken, barely a whisper. She's very ill. Richard leaned forward, his full attention on her. Tell me. The story came in fragments. Kidney failure. Progressive, worsening. The local clinic had done what they could, but she needed surgery, specialists, care that didn't exist in their village. The cost was impossible, more than Mirabel could save in years, more than her family could ever hope to afford. My siblings, Mirabel whispered, her hands twisting the letter. Sophia is 16, Marco is 14, Lucia is 12. They're taking care of her alone. They're children and they're watching our mother die, and I'm here and I can't. Her voice broke completely. Years of held pain spilled out in racking sobs, her body folding forward as if trying to contain an anguish too large for one person to hold. Richard's heart shattered watching her. This woman who'd borne so much with such dignity, finally breaking under a weight no one should have to carry alone. I have to go home, Mirabel managed between sobs. I have to be there. But the money for the surgery, the specialists, I've been sending everything I can, but it's not enough, it's never enough, and now. I'll help, Richard said immediately. Medical care, surgery, whatever she needs. I'll arrange everything. Mirabel shook her head violently. I can't accept charity. You've already given me so much, the scholarship, the position, David's education. I can't take more. I've already taken too much. This isn't charity, Mirabel. Richard's voice was gentle but firm. This is family. The word hung between them, enormous and impossible and somehow exactly right. Mirabel looked up at him through tears, her face torn between hope and pride, between desperate need and the armor she'd built to survive. I don't know how I'd ever repay. You already have. Every day. Every lesson with David. Every moment you've chosen to give when you could have withheld. Richard reached across the table, not touching her but close enough to ground her. Let me do this. Please. Mirabel buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and ancient. Grief for her mother, guilt for the years away, loneliness for everything she'd sacrificed, and now, finally, the overwhelming relief of not being alone. Richard sat with her, bearing witness, until the storm passed. Rachel stood outside the kitchen door, listening to every word. Her face remained carefully neutral, but behind her eyes, calculations were running. An opportunity had just presented itself. She waited until Mirabel had retreated to her room, eyes red and swollen, before she made her move. She found Mirabel sitting on her narrow bed, staring at the letter in her hands. May I come in? Rachel's voice was surprisingly gentle. Mirabel looked up, surprised. Rachel had barely spoken to her since the confrontation. Mrs. Robinson. Of course. Rachel sat beside her on the bed, maintaining careful distance but projecting something that might have been mistaken for compassion. I heard about your mother. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mirabel said quietly, uncertain where this was going. I know Richard offered to help. Rachel paused, choosing her words carefully. And I know you're too proud to accept what feels like charity. But I'd like to make you a different offer. Mirabel's hands tightened on the letter. What kind of offer? I'll give you $200,000. Cash. Today. Enough for your mother's surgery, your siblings' education, your family's security for years. Rachel's voice remained soft, reasonable. All I ask is that you don't come back. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples of meaning spreading outward. You want me to leave, Mirabel said flatly. I want you to help your family. Rachel's smile was gentle, concerned even. Think about it, Mirabel. Your mother is dying. Your siblings need you. You've been away for 3 years already. Do you really want to choose this job, this family that isn't yours, over them? I'm not choosing against them. Aren't you? Rachel tilted her head. Richard will help, yes. He'll send doctors, pay bills. But you won't be there. You'll be here, caught in the middle of our marriage problems, teaching a child who isn't yours while your own family suffers without you. Mirabel's breath caught. The words struck exactly where Rachel intended, the guilt Mirabel had been carrying for years. This way, Rachel continued, you go home. You're there for your mother's surgery, her recovery. You're there for your siblings when they need you most. And you have financial security, real security, to rebuild your life. Finish your degree there. Build the bridges you always dreamed of. For your own people, in your own country. It was so much money. Life-changing money. Money that could save her mother, educate her siblings, rebuild everything she'd lost when her father died. And all she had to do was leave. Go home. Be with her family. But David's face appeared in her mind. His joy during lessons. His trust. His love. And Richard, who'd seen her when everyone else looked through her. Who'd fought for her against his entire world. You're destroying this family, Rachel said quietly. You know you are. My marriage, Richard's reputation, David's stability, all of it falling apart because of this situation. Is that really what you want? To be responsible for breaking apart a child's home? I never wanted. I know you didn't. That's why I'm giving you a way to do the right thing. For everyone. Rachel pulled out an envelope, thick with cash. 200,000. Decide by morning. Take it and go home to your family. Or refuse it, and watch me fight for my son in ways that won't be pleasant for anyone. Rachel stood, placing the envelope on the narrow desk. Think about it. Really think about what's best, not for you, not for Richard, but for David. For your mother. For everyone. She left, closing the door softly behind her. Mirabel sat alone, staring at the envelope, her mind a chaos of impossible choices. Richard found her at 2 a.m, her suitcase open on the bed, belongings folded with mechanical precision. Silent tears streamed down her face as she packed, her movements automatic, like a woman walking through a nightmare. Mirabel. His voice was sharp with panic. What are you doing? She couldn't answer at first, couldn't find words through the tightness in her throat. Richard stepped into the small room, taking in the scene, the packed suitcase, the envelope on the desk, her devastated face. Talk to me, he said quietly. Please. So she did. Everything spilled out, Rachel's offer, the ultimatum, the impossible choice between her family and, what? These people who weren't hers, this life that wasn't meant for her, this hope she had no right to hold. Richard's jaw tightened as she spoke, fury flashing across his face. But he mastered it, forcing himself to focus on Mirabel, not his rage at Rachel's manipulation. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, thinking hard. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, certain. What do you want to do? Truly. Mirabel let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I want to be with my mother. But I don't want to abandon David. I don't want to, she stopped, unable to finish. Then don't. Richard looked up at her, his eyes clear. We'll all go. What? My private jet. We fly to your country tomorrow. We bring a medical team, the best specialists I can find. We stay as long as your mother needs us. Richard stood, his decision made. David comes with us. He needs to see the world outside his privilege anyway. He needs to understand where you come from, what you've sacrificed. Richard, you can't, your business, Rachel, the scandal. For once in my life, I'm choosing what actually matters. His voice was soft but absolute. I'm choosing people over profit. Family over reputation. Love over fear. But Rachel will. Rachel will do whatever she was going to do anyway. This doesn't change that. Richard moved closer, his presence grounding her. Mirabel, I'm not asking permission. I'm not negotiating. We're going. All of us. Together. A small sound came from the doorway. David stood there in his pajamas, eyes wide, hair mussed from sleep. Miss Mirabel? Are you leaving? Mirabel's hand flew to her mouth, fresh tears spilling. David ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Please don't go. Please. I need you. Richard knelt beside them, his hand on his son's shoulder. She's not leaving, David. We're going with her. We're going to help her family. David pulled back, looking between them. Really? We're going to help Miss Mirabel's mom. Really? The boy's face split into a smile even through his tears. Like a mission? Like heroes. Exactly like that, Richard said softly. They sat together in that small room, the billionaire, his son, and the woman they'd both chosen, having an impromptu family meeting at 2 a.m. Richard explained the plan. David asked 100 questions. Mirabel cried quietly, overwhelmed by the impossible reality that someone was finally fighting for her instead of dismissing her. For the first time in 3 years, Mirabel wasn't alone. As dawn approached, Richard made phone calls. His pilot. A medical team. Travel arrangements. His voice calm, decisive, allowing no argument. On the desk, Rachel's envelope sat unopened, rejected. By the time Rachel woke, the house would be empty except for her. And on the kitchen counter, a note in Richard's handwriting. Gone to do what you should have supported from the beginning. We'll talk when I return. Mirabel sat on her bed, surrounded by the 2 people who'd chosen her, and allowed herself to believe, for the first time since her father died, that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to be chosen. The private jet cut through clouds like a needle through silk, sunlight streaming through the oval windows. David pressed his face against the glass, watching the world transform beneath him. First cities, then farmland, then terrain he'd never imagined, all rendered tiny and fragile from 30,000 feet. Dad, look. Those mountains are huge. His breath fogged the window. Are we really going all the way there? We really are, buddy. Richard reached over and ruffled his son's hair, something he'd started doing more in recent weeks, this small gesture of affection that had once felt foreign. Mirabel sat across the aisle, her hands twisted together in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing. She'd barely spoken since takeoff, caught between desperate hope and paralyzing fear. What if they arrived too late? What if her mother had worsened in the days it took to arrange everything? What if? Mirabel. Richard's voice was gentle. She's going to be okay. The medical team is already on their way. We'll be there soon. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned to look out her own window. Somewhere down there, getting closer with every passing minute, was home. A place she'd left behind, but never really left at all. Richard's phone buzzed insistently. Rachel's name flashed across the screen, the 7th call in 2 hours. He'd listened to the first voicemail, her voice tight with fury, demanding he return immediately with David, threatening legal action. The second voicemail was from her lawyer, using words like kidnapping and custody violation, though Richard's own lawyer had assured him these were empty threats. Custody hadn't been formally established, and he had every legal right to travel with his son. He declined the call and returned his attention to the woman sitting across from him, to the boy marveling at the world below, to the choice he'd made that felt more right than anything he'd done in decades. The landing was rough, the regional airport was small, the runway cracked and weathered. The jet's wheels touched down with a jolt that made David laugh with excitement and Mirabel grip her armrest with white knuckles. Outside, the contrast was immediate and jarring. The sleek private jet sat on humble tarmac, surrounded by a landscape of simple buildings and dusty roads. The air was different here, warmer, carrying scents Richard couldn't name, filled with sounds of life lived without the insulation of wealth. A convoy of vehicles waited, some rented, some borrowed from local hospitals. The medical team would arrive within hours, traveling separately with specialized equipment. Richard had spared no expense, made no compromises. If money could save Mirabel's mother, he'd use every dollar he had. The drive to the village took 2 hours on roads that barely deserved the name. Dust billowed around their vehicle as they bounced over ruts and rocks. David's excitement gradually gave way to quiet observation, his young eyes taking in a world his privilege had never let him see. Children in worn clothes played in yards. Houses were cobbled together from whatever materials were available: corrugated metal, weathered wood, concrete blocks. Laundry hung on lines strung between trees. Cooking fires sent smoke curling into the afternoon sky. "Dad," David whispered, pressing close to Richard. "Why don't they have regular houses?" "Because not everyone has the same resources we do," Richard said quietly, aware of Mirabel listening from the front seat. "Some people have to work much harder just to survive." "That's not fair." "No, it's not." Mirabel turned to look back at them, her eyes glistening. "My village is just ahead." As they rounded a bend, Richard saw people gathering, a community drawn by news of Mirabel's return. Faces appeared in doorways, children ran alongside the vehicle, and by the time they stopped in front of a small house that was somehow both humble and dignified, a crowd had formed. Mirabel's siblings appeared first. Lucia at 16, trying to be brave and adult but crumbling the moment she saw her sister. Marco at 14, skinny and serious and suddenly sobbing. Sophia at 12, running forward with a cry that cut through Richard's heart. They collided with Mirabel in a tangle of arms and tears and words in a language Richard didn't understand but felt in his bones. This was love. This was family. This was what mattered. Richard and David stood back, witnesses to a reunion that made Richard's chest ache with something he couldn't name. David reached for his hand, and Richard took it, holding tight. The village elder approached, an old man with weathered skin and kind eyes. "You are Mr. Robinson," he said in careful English. "We are grateful you have brought our daughter home. And grateful for the doctors coming to help." "I'm grateful for the chance to help," Richard replied honestly. "We take care of our own," the elder said with quiet pride. "But we thank you for seeing our daughter's worth." Inside the small house, Mirabel's mother lay on a narrow bed, her face gaunt but conscious. When she saw Mirabel, tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. Mother and daughter spoke rapidly in their language, hands clasped, years of separation and worry and love pouring out in the space of minutes. Richard stood in the doorway, David pressed against his side, and understood something fundamental: Mirabel hadn't just been sending money home. She'd been carrying these people with her every single day, their weight and their love and their need, working herself to exhaustion to give them what his family took for granted. The medical team arrived as sunset painted the sky in colors Richard had never seen from his penthouse office. Specialists, nurses, portable equipment, everything needed to assess and treat Mirabel's mother. The village watched with amazement as technology and expertise descended on their humble community, brought by a woman who'd left as a maid and returned as a savior. The village elder offered to show Richard around while the medical team worked. David came along, his hand in his father's, his eyes wide with wonder and growing understanding. The schoolhouse was a single room with a rusted tin roof and walls that let in more light than they should. 20 children of various ages crowded onto rough benches, sharing torn textbooks between 3 or 4 students. A young teacher, barely 20 herself, taught without salary, farming in the mornings to support herself, educating in the afternoons because someone had to. Mirabel was going to build new school, the elder said, watching Richard's face. She had designs, plans. After her degree, she would come home and build. Not just for our village, for whole region. Education hub, she called it. Richard saw it then, not what was, but what could have been. What still could be, if given the chance. She told her mother all her dreams, the elder continued. Even now, when mother is sick, she talks of what Mirabel will build someday. It's what keeps her fighting. They walked past the water pump, the only source of clean water for miles. Past houses without electricity. Past fields where people worked with tools that were generations old. But Richard also saw what statistics never captured: children laughing as they played. Neighbors helping neighbors. Genuine community in a way his gated neighborhood had never achieved. Poverty, yes. Hardship, absolutely. But also richness of spirit that his wealth had never bought. That evening, they sat with Mirabel's family for a simple meal: rice, beans, vegetables grown in the family plot. David sat between Sophia and Marco, communicating through gestures and laughter, the language barrier meaning nothing to childhood's universal friendship. Mirabel translated stories, her childhood, her father's dreams. He'd been a teacher, she explained, beloved in the community. When he fell ill, he'd walked miles in a storm to reach a clinic, collapsed from exhaustion and fever. By the time help came, it was too late. Could have been prevented, Mirabel said quietly, with accessible health care. With infrastructure. With everything this village doesn't have. Richard watched her face as she spoke, seeing how her father's death had shaped everything. Her drive to study engineering, her dreams of building, her willingness to sacrifice everything for family. Her strength didn't exist despite this poverty. It was forged because of the love within it. Days passed in a rhythm Richard had never experienced. The medical team worked with careful expertise, preparing for surgery, stabilizing Mirabel's mother. Richard stayed in a humble guest house, sleeping on a thin mattress, using a shared bathroom, making no complaints. He could have returned to his jet, to comfort and luxury. But something kept him here, learning, witnessing, transforming. David adapted with the easy flexibility of childhood. He played with village children, learning words in their language, teaching them English words in return. He had no tablet, no video games, no luxury toys, and seemed happier than Richard had ever seen him. Running through fields. Kicking a worn soccer ball. Learning card games that required only imagination. One evening, as the village gathered around a fire, a young girl approached Mirabel shyly. "Miss Mirabel, will you teach us? Like you taught the children in the rich country." Mirabel hesitated, glancing at Richard. She'd be leaving again soon, returning to finish her degree, to her job, to her life. Starting something here would mean, "Please," the girl whispered. "We want to learn too." Richard watched Mirabel's face transform. This is where her heart lives, he realized. Not in his mansion, not even in the university classroom. Here. With her people. "Get some sticks," Mirabel said, her voice thick with emotion. "And anyone who wants to learn, come sit." Within minutes, 20 children gathered in a circle around her. Mirabel knelt in the dirt, using a stick to draw equations and diagrams by firelight. She taught geometry, showing how shapes repeated in nature, in their houses, in the world around them. She made mathematics into magic. David sat among them, just another student, equal in his hunger to learn. Richard stood in the shadows, recording the scene on his phone, not for social media, not for proof, but because he needed to remember this moment, this truth about what mattered. Later, as the children dispersed and Mirabel sat exhausted but radiant, her mother called Richard to her bedside. The old woman spoke, and Lucia translated. "My mother asks, what are your intentions for Mirabel?" Richard blinked, surprised. "I want to help her finish her degree, continue teaching David." The mother spoke again, and Lucia translated with a small smile. "She says, not romantic intentions. She knows that's not what this is. She means, will you use her brilliance for yourself, or will you let her bloom?" The question struck Richard like a physical blow. He thought of his offer, scholarship, employment, teaching David. All of it centering on what he needed, what his son needed. Using Mirabel's gifts for his purposes, however well-intentioned. "I'm still learning what she deserves," Richard admitted honestly. The mother nodded as Lucia translated, then spoke again with surprising force for someone so weak. She says, "Mirabel deserves to choose. Give her that. Real choice, not gratitude disguised as obligation." Richard sat with those words long after, watching the fire burn down, thinking about choice and obligation and the difference between them. Surgery day arrived with tension thick enough to taste. The village gathered in prayer, different faiths, different traditions, all united in hope. Richard found himself included in the circle, hands held by strangers who'd accepted him not because of his wealth but because he'd chosen to be present. The surgery took 4 hours. Richard paced. David sat with Sophia, both children too worried for words. Mirabel wore a path in the dirt outside the temporary medical tent, her lips moving in silent prayer. When the surgeon finally emerged and gave a thumbs up, the village erupted. Mirabel collapsed to her knees, sobbing with relief. The surgery was successful. Her mother would recover. That night, the village celebrated with music and food and joy that money could never manufacture. Richard watched Mirabel dance with her siblings, her face unburdened for the first time since he'd known her. She'd been carrying them all this time, their weight, their need, their love. And now, finally, she could set it down, even if just for a moment. She was radiant. Free. Whole. Richard pulled out his phone and made a call. His foundation director answered on the second ring. I need you to start a new project, Richard said, his eyes on Mirabel dancing in the firelight. Immediately. Education infrastructure in underserved communities. Starting here. I'll send you details, but I want ground broken within the month. How big are we talking? Richard watched children gather around Mirabel again, even in the midst of celebration, hungry to learn from her. He saw the crumbling schoolhouse, the village without electricity, the potential waiting to be unleashed. Big, he said. Big enough to matter. Big enough to change everything. As he ended the call, Mirabel caught his eye across the fire. She smiled, genuinely radiantly, and in that moment, Richard knew he'd made the right choice. Not the choice to help her. The choice to witness her. To let her teach him what real wealth looked like. Morning light filtered through the window of the small guest house where Richard had spent the night. He'd slept better on that thin mattress than he had in months on his $1,000 bed back home. Outside, he could hear the village waking, roosters crowing, children's voices, the sound of life lived close to the earth. He found Mirabel sitting outside her family's home, watching her mother sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. The surgery had been successful. Recovery would take time, but the immediate crisis had passed. Walk with me, Richard asked quietly. Mirabel looked up, surprised, but nodded. They walked through the village in comfortable silence, past homes where people greeted Mirabel with warm smiles and grateful words. She'd become a hero overnight, the daughter who'd returned with salvation. Richard led her to the crumbling schoolhouse. In the morning light, its deficiencies were even more apparent: the rusted roof, the cracked walls, the dirt floor where children sat to learn. Tell me what this village needs, Richard said. Really needs. Not what you think I want to hear. What an engineer would assess and recommend. Mirabel hesitated, her old training of invisibility asserting itself. Mr. Robinson, you've already done so much. Richard. And I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for expertise. He turned to face her fully. You're an engineer. You grew up here. You understand both the problem and the solution. So tell me, what would you build? Something shifted in Mirabel's posture. The servant fell away, and the scholar emerged. She looked at the schoolhouse, then around the village, her eyes taking on the focus of someone calculating load-bearing walls and water systems and electrical grids. A new school building, she began slowly. Not just one room, multiple classrooms for different age groups. Library. Computer lab with solar power. Teacher housing so we can attract qualified educators who won't have to farm just to survive. Richard nodded, pulling out his phone to take notes. What else? Mirabel's words came faster now, her hands moving as she sketched invisible structures. Clean water system throughout the village. Solar electricity for homes. Not just this village, this could be a model for the whole region. An educational hub serving multiple communities. Scholarship program for students who can't afford to continue their education. She painted a vision of infrastructure serving humanity, of careful engineering choices that would last generations. Richard listened, recording her words, seeing not just a village improvement project but something larger. A legacy. What if you ran it? He asked when she finally paused for breath. Ran what? All of it. The foundation. The projects. The vision. Richard put his phone away, giving her his full attention. What if this wasn't my charity project with you as a consultant, but your foundation with me as a supporter? Mirabel stared at him. I'm not qualified. I haven't even finished my degree. You're more qualified than anyone I know, Richard countered. You understand both the need and the solution. You know these communities from the inside. You have the engineering knowledge and the cultural competence and the vision to make real, lasting change. But Mirabel's voice caught. I don't know how to run a foundation. I don't know how to manage budgets and contractors and... Neither did I once. We'll hire people who do. But the vision has to be yours. The leadership has to be yours. Because this can't be another wealthy person deciding what poor communities need. It has to come from someone who understands. Mirabel sat down on the schoolhouse steps, her hands trembling. This is too much. You're offering me too much. I'm offering you what you deserve. What you've always deserved. Richard sat beside her. The only question is, do you want it? Before Mirabel could answer, Richard's phone rang. His lawyer's name flashed on the screen. Richard, we have a situation. His lawyer's voice was tight with stress. Rachel has filed for divorce and initiated custody proceedings. She's claiming you abandoned the family, took David out of the country without proper consent, prioritized a stranger over your own wife and child. Richard closed his eyes. He'd known this was coming, but the reality still hit like a punch. What's our position? Legally, you're solid. You have every right to travel with your son. But she's building a narrative about instability, poor judgment, inappropriate relationships with staff. The media is eating it up. Your board called an emergency meeting. Some members are discussing removing you as CEO. Let them. Silence on the other end. Richard, did you just say? I said let them. I'll deal with it when I get back. We're not done here yet. The investors are nervous. They're threatening to pull funding. If you're removed as CEO, then I'm removed. Some things are more important. Richard ended the call and found Mirabel watching him with wide, worried eyes. She'd heard enough to understand. You should go back, she said immediately. I can stay, finish things here. You need to save your company, David, Richard called. His son appeared from around the corner, where he'd been playing with Sophia. Come here for a second. David jogged over, his face flushed with happiness, his clothes dusty from play. He looked more alive than Richard had ever seen him in their mansion. Buddy, we might need to go home early. Moms, there are some problems we need to deal with. David's face fell. Then he straightened, looking between his father and Mirabel. We should stay, he said with 6-year-old certainty. This is important. But there's some difficult stuff happening. Mom never wanted us anyway, David said simply. Not really. She wanted the idea of us. But Miss Mirabel wants us. And the kids here need the school. This matters more. The truth from a child's mouth hit Richard harder than any lawyer's warning. David knew. Had always known. That his mother's love was conditional, performative, tied to appearances rather than genuine care. 3 more days, Richard decided. We stay 3 more days. We do this right. Launch the foundation properly. Then we go back and face whatever's waiting. Mirabel opened her mouth to protest, but Richard raised a hand. I'm not asking permission. I'm not negotiating. This is my choice. These are my consequences to bear. Construction began the next morning. Richard had hired local contractors, brought in materials, mobilized resources with the efficiency that had made him a billionaire. But now that efficiency served a different purpose. The village transformed before their eyes. Foundations were laid. Walls went up. The skeleton of a real school building emerged from the red earth, rising like hope made concrete. Mirabel worked alongside architects and engineers, speaking their technical language, making decisions with confidence Richard had never seen in her before. She was in her element, calculating, designing, problem-solving. This was who she'd always been meant to be. Richard watched her bloom and felt something close to awe. How had the world almost missed this? How had he almost missed this? The press arrived on the second day, reporters Richard had deliberately invited. He'd learned something about narrative control. If Rachel wanted to paint him as unstable, he'd offer a different story. Billionaire's unconventional path to giving back, the headlines read. Education Foundation launched in remote village. Richard gave interviews, standing beside Mirabel, explaining her role not as his employee but as the foundation's visionary director. This woman has more vision in her little finger than my entire board of directors combined, he told one reporter. She's not my charity case. She's my teacher. Mirabel was uncomfortable with the attention at first, but when asked about the project, she spoke with eloquence that left reporters scrambling to keep up. Education access. Infrastructure as human right. Community's own agency in development. She transformed complexity into poetry. David participated too, helping paint the school walls alongside village children. Photos went viral, a wealthy American child working side by side with impoverished kids, all of them covered in paint, all of them laughing. The images were more powerful than any press release. Public opinion began to shift. Still criticism, of course. Still voices calling Richard irresponsible, calling this a publicity stunt. But other voices emerged too, voices praising his courage, his commitment to genuine change, his willingness to challenge conventional charity models. On the third day, the foundation was officially launched. Mirabel stood before a small gathering of villagers, local officials, and carefully selected press, her voice steady despite her nervousness. The Mirabel Foundation for Educational Equity, Richard announced, the name deliberate. Not his name. Hers. Mirabel spoke about her father, the teacher who died trying to reach medical care. About dreams deferred and second chances. About the people who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. I am just the bridge, she said, her voice catching with emotion. Between need and resources. Between potential and opportunity. This foundation isn't about one village or one school. It's about every child who has brilliance trapped by circumstance. Every teacher working without resources. Every community told they don't deserve investment. The village elder performed a traditional blessing ceremony, honoring Richard, David, and Mirabel as family. Not by blood, but by choice. Not through obligation, but through love. That night, as stars filled the sky and the village celebrated with music and food, Richard found himself standing apart, watching. David danced with Sophia and Marco, teaching them American kids' games, learning their songs in return. Mirabel moved through the crowd, hugging neighbors, crying happy tears, finally unburdened. She found him eventually, drawn by some invisible thread that had connected them since that night he'd found her teaching. "We leave tomorrow," Richard said quietly. "I know." Mirabel stood beside him, both of them watching the celebration. "What happens when we return?" "Honestly? I don't know. Probably lose everything. The CEO position. The marriage. Maybe even the company if the board gets aggressive enough." "Do you regret it?" Richard looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who'd been invisible for 3 years. This brilliant mind that almost went to waste. This heart that gave freely despite having so little. Not for a second. Mirabel's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of the responsibility. Of disappointing you. Of failing everyone who's counting on this. You couldn't disappoint me if you tried." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that only exists between people who've witnessed each other's transformations. "What about David?" Mirabel asked. "The custody battle?" "Rachel doesn't want him," Richard said with painful honesty. "She wants to win. There's a difference. I'll fight for him, really fight this time. Not with money, with presence. With showing up." "And the foundation?" "You'll split your time. Finish your degree through distance learning. Spend time here overseeing projects. Time there teaching David. We'll figure it out." "That's not much of a plan." "The best plans rarely are." Richard smiled slightly. "But it's real. It's honest. It's built on what actually matters." Mirabel turned to face him fully. "What about Rachel? Your marriage?" "That marriage ended years ago. We just didn't have the courage to admit it. This trip just made it official." "I don't want to be the reason." "You're not the reason," Richard interrupted gently. "You're the awakening. I was sleepwalking through life, building empires but missing everything that mattered. You woke me up. You and David both." Mirabel looked away, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to do this. How to be this person you think I am." "You already are this person. You've always been this person. The world just never gave you space to show it." The music swelled behind them. David's laughter carried across the night air. The village celebrated not just a school but a future, not just buildings but hope made tangible. Morning came too quickly. The private jet sat waiting on the distant airstrip. Suitcases were packed. Promises were made. The entire village gathered to say goodbye. Mirabel's mother, weak but conscious, held her daughter tight and whispered words in their language that made Mirabel cry. Her siblings clung to her, made her promise to return, to not forget them. "I could never forget you," Mirabel said through tears. "You're why I do this. All of it." David hugged each of Mirabel's siblings, promised to write letters, to send photos, to come back and visit. Sophia gave him a handmade bracelet. Marco taught him one last phrase in their language. Lucia made him promise to take care of their sister. Richard shook hands with the village elder, who pulled him close and spoke words that were translated: "You came as a stranger. You leave as family. The door is always open." As they walked toward the waiting vehicle, Mirabel stopped and turned back, taking one last long look at her home. The place she'd left behind, but never really left. The people she'd carried with her through every day of exile. "You're not leaving," Richard said quietly beside her. "You're expanding." Mirabel smiled through tears. "That's a generous way to put it." "It's the truth." David took both their hands, his father's on one side, Mirabel's on the other. Three people who'd found each other against all odds. An unlikely family bound not by blood but by choice, not by obligation but by love. They climbed into the vehicle. As it pulled away, the village waved, children running alongside, calling out blessings and promises. Mirabel watched through the rear window until they turned a corner and her home disappeared from view. She didn't know what waited for them back in the city. Legal battles, public scrutiny, the collapse of everything Richard had built. Uncertainty on every side. But for the first time in 3 years, Mirabel wasn't facing it alone. She had a foundation with her name on it. A village counting on her. A child who loved her. And a man who'd risked everything to finally see her. The jet lifted into the sky, carrying them toward whatever came next. Behind them, in a small village that would soon have a school bearing her father's name, hope was taking root. And ahead of them, in a city that thought it knew them, everything was about to change. Mirabel looked out the window at the clouds and allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved all of it. The wheels touched down on familiar tarmac, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Richard looked out the jet window and saw a wall of photographers, cameras raised like weapons, reporters jostling for position behind security barriers. News vans lined the private terminal. Helicopters circled overhead. "Dad." David's voice was small, scared. "Why are there so many people?" "Because we're news," Richard said quietly, his hand finding his son's shoulder. "But it's okay. We just walk through. Don't answer any questions. Stay close." Mirabel sat frozen, her face pale, staring at the chaos waiting for them. "This is my fault. All of this. Don't." Richard's voice was firm. "This is Rachel's doing, not yours. And we're going to handle it together." His lawyer met them at the bottom of the jet stairs, his expression grim. "Richard, we have a problem. Rachel obtained a temporary custody order this morning. Claims David is at risk due to your unstable behavior and questionable associations." The words hit like a physical blow. "What does that mean?" "It means David can't go back to the mansion. Rachel has primary residence there, and until the custody hearing next week, you're restricted to supervised visitation unless you can secure alternative housing." Richard looked at David, who'd gone very still, trying to understand what the adult words meant. "So we're homeless." "We'll get a hotel," the lawyer said quickly. "I've already made arrangements." "But Richard, this is serious. She's building a strong narrative: unstable billionaire, inappropriate relationship with staff, child exposed to dangerous situations." The judge granted the temporary order based on those claims. As they walked through the terminal, cameras flashed like lightning. Questions were shouted from every direction. "Mr. Robinson, is it true you abandoned your wife for the nanny? Did you really take your son to a third-world country without permission? Is your company removing you as CEO? Mirabel, what's your relationship with Mr. Robinson?" Richard kept moving, his arm around David, Mirabel close behind them. They climbed into the waiting car, and only when the doors closed did he allow himself to breathe. The hotel suite was luxurious but felt like exile. David stood at the window, looking out at the city skyline, his small shoulders tense. "Why doesn't Mom want me to come home?" he asked quietly. Richard knelt beside his son, choosing honesty. "Mom is angry. And sometimes when grown-ups are angry, they do things that hurt the people they love. But I promise you, I'm going to fix this. I don't want to live with Mom if you and Miss Mirabel can't be there too." The simple statement cracked Richard's heart. We'll figure it out, buddy. I promise. The media war began immediately. Within hours, two competing narratives emerged on social media, on news programs, in opinion pieces. Rachel's story: concerned mother protects son from erratic father who abandoned his family for inappropriate relationship with household staff. Billionaire's midlife crisis puts child at risk. Richard's story: father finally present, making ethical choices, supporting brilliant woman's emergence from invisible servitude. Philanthropic work in underserved communities. The internet divided into camps. Hashtag Team Rachel attracted traditionalists, the class-conscious, those uncomfortable with boundary crossing. Hashtag Team Richard drew people moved by the foundation story, by images of David painting school walls with village children, by the narrative of redemption and awakening. Interview requests flooded in. Richard's PR team advised silence. Let the lawyers handle it, don't give Rachel ammunition, maintain dignified distance from the spectacle. Richard did the opposite. He accepted an invitation to appear on the country's most watched news program. Prime time. Millions of viewers. No script, no safety net. Mr. Robinson, the anchor began, her expression carefully neutral. Your wife claims you become unstable, that you've prioritized your relationship with your nanny over your family. How do you respond? By telling the truth, Richard said calmly. 3 months ago, I came home early from a business trip and found my son being taught advanced mathematics by a woman I'd never truly seen before. A woman who'd been in my house for 3 years but was invisible to me because I'd been trained not to see people in service positions as fully human. He told the complete story. The mockery at the dinner party, Rachel's cruelty, the guests' laughter, David's tears. The discovery of Mirabel teaching in secret. Her engineering background, her deferred dreams, her father's death. The foundation launch in her village. I didn't abandon my family, Richard said, his voice steady but emotional. I finally showed up for my son. For the first time in his life, I chose to be present instead of chasing the next deal, the next merger, the next empty achievement. The anchor turned to Mirabel, who sat beside Richard, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ms. Mirabel, you've been called a homewrecker, an opportunist. What do you say to that? Mirabel took a breath, met the camera's eye, and spoke with quiet dignity. I'm not a homewrecker. I'm an educator who met a curious child and shared what I knew. I'm an engineer whose dreams were interrupted by tragedy, but who was given a second chance by someone who finally saw me as a person, not as furniture. She explained the foundation, her vision for educational equity, the communities that would benefit. She spoke about poverty and potential, about hidden brilliance waiting for recognition, about the difference between charity and empowerment. Her eloquence was undeniable. Her intelligence radiated through the screen. And her humility, the complete absence of agenda or manipulation, was compelling in its authenticity. The footage from the village played. David laughing with children who had nothing but gave everything. Mirabel teaching under stars. The school rising from red earth. A billionaire kneeling in prayer circles with villagers who'd welcomed him as family. Public opinion shifted like wind changing direction. Old colleagues came forward. University professors, she was our top student, brilliant, dedicated, ethical. Former classmates, she sacrificed everything for her family. Village leaders sent video testimonials about Mirabel's character, Richard's genuine commitment, David's joy and safety. Rachel's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. The custody hearing took place in a courthouse that felt designed to intimidate, all marble and dark wood and the weight of justice rendered without mercy. Richard sat at the defendant's table, Mirabel behind him in the gallery, both dressed formally, both terrified. Rachel's legal team went first, aggressive and relentless. They painted Richard as negligent, unstable, prioritizing an employee over his wife, taking David to a dangerous third-world location without proper consent, creating an inappropriate household environment. Character witnesses paraded through, members of Rachel's social circle, business associates who'd known Richard in his absent father days, a psychiatrist who'd never met Richard but offered opinions about midlife instability patterns. Rachel herself testified with careful poise, dabbing at her eyes at appropriate moments, her voice catching when describing her fears for David's well-being. Richard has changed, she said, looking directly at the judge. I don't recognize the man I married. His judgment has become compromised. His priorities distorted. I just want to protect our son." It was a masterful performance. Even Richard had to admit that. Then his team began. The medical team testified that the trip was humanitarian, safe, carefully planned. The village elder appeared via video link, speaking through a translator about David's warmth, curiosity, the respect shown by both father and son. Foundation directors testified to Richard's vision, competence, and genuine transformation. David's school counselor took the stand. For years, David was withdrawn, anxious, reluctant to engage. In the past few months, he's blossomed. More confident, more curious, genuinely happy. Whatever changes have occurred in his home life, they've been beneficial. Then Mirabel was cold. Rachel's lawyer approached her like a predator sensing weakness. "Ms. Mirabel, isn't it true you've been employed in the Robinson household for 3 years?" "Yes." "And during that time, you were paid to provide child care?" "Yes." "Isn't it convenient that your supposed brilliance only came to light once Mr. Robinson was available? That your engineering background only became relevant when it served your interests?" Mirabel remained calm, her hands folded, her voice steady. "My brilliance, as you call it, has always existed. Mr. Robinson simply became the first person willing to see it." "Your credentials were verified?" "Yes. My university transcripts, my professor's recommendations, everything is documented." The lawyer changed tactics. "Why were you working as a nanny if you have this impressive educational background?" Mirabel met his eyes directly. "Because poverty doesn't erase intelligence. It just hides opportunity. My father died, leaving my family in debt. I had to choose between completing my degree and feeding my siblings. I chose them. That doesn't make me less brilliant. It makes me human." The courtroom fell silent. Even Rachel's lawyer seemed momentarily at a loss. Richard's attorney presented Mirabel's documentation, transcripts showing top marks, professor letters praising her extraordinary aptitude, the scholarship offer Richard had extended. Everything legitimate, everything documented, everything real. The judge called for a recess, then reconvened with an unusual request. "I'd like to speak with David." Privately, but with parents and counsel observing from behind the glass. They moved to a smaller room. David was brought in, looking tiny in the oversized chair, but trying to be brave. The judge, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, smiled at him gently. "David, I'm Judge Morrison. I just want to ask you some questions about your home and your family. There are no wrong answers. Just tell me the truth, okay?" "Okay." "Tell me about your home. What's it like?" David thought for a moment. "Mom has pretty parties. With fancy food and people in nice clothes. But she doesn't like when I'm loud or messy. She says I need to be presentable." "And your father?" "Dad used to be gone a lot. On trips. He'd call sometimes, but he was always busy." David's voice got softer. "But now he's here. He sits with me during lessons. He asks me questions. He took me to help people in Miss Mirabel's village. Do you feel safe with your father?" "Yes." David's face lit up. "He took me on an adventure. We flew on his plane to Miss Mirabel's country, and we helped her mom get medicine, and we built a school, and I met kids who don't have as much as me, but they're really nice, and we learned together, and Dad says that's what people should do, help each other. That's what dads should do." Behind the glass, Richard pressed his hand to his mouth, tears streaming down his face. "What about your mother?" the judge asked gently. David's animation faded. He looked down at his hands, struggling with something. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Mom loves how I look. She likes when people say I'm handsome or well-behaved. But Miss Mirabel loves how I think. She asks me questions and listens to my answers and teaches me things and says I'm capable of amazing stuff." He looked up at the judge, his 6-year-old face painfully honest. "Dad is learning to love both. How I look and how I think." The courtroom was utterly silent. Rachel sat rigid, her careful composure cracking. Richard wept openly. Mirabel had her hand over her mouth, tears sliding between her fingers. The judge continued, her voice gentle. "Tell me about the trip to Miss Mirabel's village." David's whole demeanor changed, becoming animated and joyful. He described the village children, the lessons under stars, helping paint the school, learning words in a new language, playing games that didn't require toys. "Can we go back?" he asked hopefully. "I made friends there. Real friends who don't care if my clothes are expensive." "What do you think of Miss Mirabel?" David's face transformed with pure love. "She's the best teacher in the whole world. She knows everything, about math and stars and how things work and why birds fly, and she explains it so I understand, and she never gets mad when I ask too many questions, and she's nice. Really nice. Not like Mom's friends who are only nice when people are watching." "Thank you, David. You've been very brave and very helpful." A recess was called. In the hallway outside the courtroom, they waited in terrible silence. Richard and Mirabel stood close but not touching, a shared space of mutual support. David stood between them, holding both their hands, his father's on one side, Mirabel's on the other. Across the hallway, Rachel sat surrounded by her lawyers, but she looked utterly alone. 30 minutes felt like 30 hours. Finally, the bailiff called them back. "All rise." Everyone stood as Judge Morrison returned, her face impassive, revealing nothing. "Please be seated. I'm ready to rule." Judge Morrison looked out over the courtroom, her expression revealing nothing. The silence was absolute, every person holding their breath, waiting for words that would reshape lives. "I've reviewed all testimony, examined the evidence, and spoken with David at length," she began. "This is a case where both parents love their child, but love alone doesn't determine custody. What matters is the child's best interests, his safety, his development, his emotional well-being." Rachel sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Richard barely breathed. Mirabel's hand covered her mouth, tears already threatening. "The court finds that David Robinson is thriving under his current arrangement. His father has demonstrated significant growth, increased presence, and commitment to his son's holistic development, not just material provision, but emotional engagement and experiential education." The judge paused, looking at Rachel with something that might have been sympathy. "Mrs. Robinson's concerns are noted. However, the evidence shows a stable, enriching environment. The trip to Ms. Mirabel's village was not reckless endangerment but a humanitarian mission that expanded David's worldview and strengthened his relationship with his father." Richard felt David's hand slip into his, small and trusting. "Therefore, the court awards joint custody with primary residence to Mr. Richard Robinson. Mrs. Robinson will have visitation rights every other weekend and holidays as agreed upon. Ms. Mirabel's continued involvement as David's educational consultant is approved and encouraged. There will be no restrictions on David's international travel for foundation-related activities." The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through Richard's bones. Not triumph, he felt no triumph. Just profound relief and gratitude. David looked up at him, confused. "What does that mean?" Judge Morrison smiled gently at the boy. "It means you'll live primarily with your father and Miss Mirabel, but you'll visit your mother regularly. Does that sound okay?" David's face split into a cautious smile. "I can stay with Dad and Miss Mirabel?" "Yes, David. You can." Outside the courtroom, Rachel approached them. Her lawyers had already scattered, moving on to their next cases. She stood alone in her expensive suit, elegant as always, but something had shifted in her bearing. "Richard." Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual command. "Rachel." They looked at each other, two people who'd shared a life but never really knew each other. David pressed against Richard's leg, uncertain. "I never knew how to love him," Rachel said, her eyes on her son. "Not really. I knew how to present him, how to curate him, how to use him as proof of my perfect life. But actually loving him, the messy, complicated way he deserved." She shook her head. "I didn't know how." "Rachel." "But you do. You finally do." She looked at Richard, and something like respect flickered in her eyes. "And she does too, apparently." Rachel glanced at Mirabel, who stood a respectful distance away. Then she knelt in front of David, her designer suit touching the courthouse floor. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. For not being the mother you needed. I'm going to try to do better." David nodded, not quite understanding, but willing to hope. Rachel stood, straightened her jacket, and walked away, elegant, alone, but perhaps on her way to becoming someone more real. 6 months passed like water finding its level, settling into new patterns, new rhythms. The Robinson mansion transformed into something it had never been before, a home. David's artwork covered walls that once held expensive abstract pieces Rachel had chosen for aesthetic value. Mathematical equations and scientific diagrams appeared on whiteboards in multiple rooms. The formal study became a genuine learning space, organized chaos of books and projects and the evidence of minds actively engaged. David thrived. At 7 years old, he'd gained a confidence that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with being genuinely seen. He did regular video calls with children from the village, his friends now, not charity cases. They taught him words in their language, he taught them English. They shared homework problems and jokes that transcended cultural barriers. Richard worked from home most days now, attending board meetings via video conference, reviewing contracts from his study while David and Mirabel worked at the whiteboard nearby. Some board members had left, uncomfortable with his new priorities. New ones had joined, people who believed that purpose and profit could coexist. The company's focus shifted toward ethical investments and education initiatives. Surprisingly, it became more profitable. Turns out people wanted to invest in businesses that gave a damn about something besides shareholder value. Mirabel completed her engineering degree through a combination of distance learning and intensive on-campus programs. She split her time between countries, weeks here teaching David and managing the foundation's U.S. operations, weeks there overseeing construction projects and working with local communities. The Mirabel Foundation expanded to 3 villages, then 5, then 10. Educational hubs with libraries, computer labs, teacher housing, clean water systems, solar electricity, scholarship programs. The model was studied by development organizations worldwide, how to do philanthropy right, community-led, expert-driven, sustainably funded. Media coverage shifted from scandal to celebration. The Nanny Who Built Schools became Mirabel's unwanted title. She remained humble, redirecting attention to the communities she served, to the teachers who worked without recognition, to the children whose potential was finally being unlocked. She lived in the guest house on the Robinson property, her choice, maintaining appropriate boundaries. She and Richard had developed a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose, but she was careful never to cross lines that might confuse David or provide ammunition for those still watching, judging, waiting for moral failure. David still called her Miss Mirabel, but their relationship had deepened into something profound. Not a mother, Mirabel respected Rachel's place, encouraged David's relationship with his mom, but a beloved mentor, a trusted guide, a safe harbor. Rachel visited regularly, and slowly, painfully, her relationship with David began to heal. She'd found her own path, advocacy for mental health, speaking publicly about the performative life that had made her miserable and spread that misery to everyone around her. She was in therapy, working on herself, becoming, gradually, someone more authentic. The first annual Mirabel Foundation Gala was held at the Robinson Mansion, deliberately. Richard wanted to reclaim the space where Mirabel had been mocked, where cruelty had been disguised as social entertainment, where everything had begun. The guest list was intentional, wealthy donors who could fund expansion, yes, but also village representatives, scholarship recipients, teachers from the foundation schools. 2 worlds colliding in a way that made both uncomfortable and, hopefully, better. Rachel arrived late, surprising everyone. She'd RSVP'd maybe, and most assumed she wouldn't show. But there she was, elegant as always but softer somehow, her armor showing cracks that made her more human. She found Richard in a quiet corner. The house looks different. The house looks happy, Richard corrected gently. Rachel smiled sadly. Yes, it does. She looked around at David's artwork on the walls, at Mirabel talking with village elders via video screen, at the life being lived rather than performed. I'm glad. Genuinely. It wasn't reconciliation, they'd never be that. But it was acceptance. Understanding. 2 people who'd grown apart acknowledging the truth of it. Rachel approached Mirabel during a lull in the evening's program. Mirabel stiffened, old instinct screaming caution. You're good with him, Rachel said quietly. With David. Thank you. Mirabel nodded, gracious despite the awkwardness. He's an exceptional child. I wish I'd seen that sooner. Rachel's eyes glistened with genuine regret. instead of just seeing what I wanted him to be. They wouldn't be friends. The wound went too deep. But perhaps in time, they could be civil. Perhaps that was enough. Richard took the stage as the gala's featured speaker. The crowd quieted. Several hundred people, ranging from billionaires to village farmers, all gathered to support a vision that had started with a whiteboard and a mocked woman's patient teaching. 10 months ago, Richard began, I came home early from a business trip. I expected silence. Instead, I found my son learning advanced mathematics from our nanny. And in that moment, my entire world shattered and rebuilt itself. He told the full story, the mockery at Rachel's dinner party, Mirabel's humiliation, his discovery, the journey to her village, the foundation's birth. The audience was captivated. Most knew pieces, but hearing it complete, unvarnished, honest, it hit differently. I was a billionaire who thought he had everything, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Billions in the bank, properties on 3 continents, respect from every financial institution that mattered. Then a nanny taught me I had nothing that mattered. Nothing real. Nothing lasting. Nothing worth leaving behind. He gestured to Mirabel, who stood to the side, uncomfortable with the attention. This woman didn't just teach my son mathematics. She taught me the most important equation: love plus sacrifice equals legacy. Everything else is just noise. The standing ovation lasted 2 full minutes. Then it was Mirabel's turn. She approached the microphone, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice steady. Thank you, Richard. But this story isn't about one nanny or one wealthy man or one child. It's bigger than that. She pressed a button, and the large screen behind her came to life with footage from the villages. Children in classrooms, teachers leading lessons, parents watching their kids learn, hope visible on every face. This is about millions of hidden geniuses waiting for someone to see them, Mirabel said. Children cleaning houses who should be designing them. Young people serving food who should be creating it. Brilliance trapped by circumstance, waiting for opportunity. The village elders appeared via live video feed, speaking about transformation, not just buildings but hope restored, not just education but dignity recognized. They spoke of Mirabel as a bridge between worlds, between need and resources, between potential and reality. The fundraising goal was surpassed within an hour. Expansion to 10 more villages approved. New partnerships formed. The ripple effect continued spreading outward. The first annual Mirabel Foundation Gala was held at the Robinson Mansion, deliberately. Richard wanted to reclaim the space where Mirabel had been mocked, where cruelty had been disguised as social entertainment, where everything had begun. The guest list was intentional: wealthy donors who could fund expansion, yes, but also village representatives, scholarship recipients, teachers from the foundation schools. 2 worlds colliding in a way that made both uncomfortable and, hopefully, better. Rachel arrived late, surprising everyone. She'd RSVP'd maybe, and most assumed she wouldn't show. But there she was, elegant as always but softer somehow, her armor showing cracks that made her more human. She found Richard in a quiet corner. The house looks different. The house looks happy, Richard corrected gently. Rachel smiled sadly. Yes, it does. She looked around at David's artwork on the walls, at Mirabel talking with village elders via video screen, at the life being lived rather than performed. I'm glad. Genuinely. It wasn't reconciliation, they'd never be that. But it was acceptance. Understanding. 2 people who'd grown apart acknowledging the truth of it. Rachel approached Mirabel during a lull in the evening's program. Mirabel stiffened, old instinct screaming caution. You're good with him, Rachel said quietly. With David. Thank you. Mirabel nodded, gracious despite the awkwardness. He's an exceptional child. I wish I'd seen that sooner. Rachel's eyes glistened with genuine regret. Instead of just seeing what I wanted him to be. They wouldn't be friends. The wound went too deep. But perhaps in time, they could be civil. Perhaps that was enough. Richard took the stage as the gala's featured speaker. The crowd quieted. Several hundred people, ranging from billionaires to village farmers, all gathered to support a vision that had started with a whiteboard and a mocked woman's patient teaching. 10 months ago, Richard began, I came home early from a business trip. I expected silence. Instead, I found my son learning advanced mathematics from our nanny. And in that moment, my entire world shattered and rebuilt itself. He told the full story, the mockery at Rachel's dinner party, Mirabel's humiliation, his discovery, the journey to her village, the foundation's birth. The audience was captivated. Most new pieces, but hearing it complete, unvarnished, honest, it hit differently. I was a billionaire who thought he had everything, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Billions in the bank, properties on 3 continents, respect from every financial institution that mattered. Then a nanny taught me I had nothing that mattered. Nothing real. Nothing lasting. Nothing worth leaving behind. He gestured to Mirabel, who stood to the side, uncomfortable with the attention. This woman didn't just teach my son mathematics. She taught me the most important equation: love plus sacrifice equals legacy. Everything else is just noise. The standing ovation lasted 2 full minutes. Then it was Mirabel's turn. She approached the microphone, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice steady. "Thank you, Richard. But this story isn't about one nanny or one wealthy man or one child. It's bigger than that." She pressed a button, and the large screen behind her came to life with footage from the villages, children in classrooms, teachers leading lessons, parents watching their kids learn, hope visible on every face. "This is about millions of hidden geniuses waiting for someone to see them," Mirabel said. "Children cleaning houses who should be designing them. Young people serving food who should be creating it. Brilliance trapped by circumstance, waiting for opportunity." The village elders appeared via live video feed. Years passed. Time, which had once moved so slowly in Rachel's cold mansion, now flew. David turned 16, a brilliant and compassionate young man who topped his class academically but spent his summers in villages, working alongside foundation staff, teaching children, building relationships that transcended privilege. He was looking at universities now, leaning toward education policy. "I want to build what Miss Mirabel started," he told Richard one evening. "Make it bigger. Make it systemic. Change how the whole world thinks about hidden potential." Family dinners were casual now, Richard, David, and Mirabel gathering around the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room. They talked about projects, about David's college applications, about the latest village school completion. Genuine family, unconventional but real. Rachel visited occasionally. Her relationship with David had healed into something honest, if not close. She'd found her own calling in mental health advocacy, speaking publicly about the performance trap that had made her miserable. "I was so unhappy," she admitted during one visit, "and I made everyone else unhappy too. I'm sorry for that. Especially to you, David." Her son, nearly grown now, had the grace to forgive. Mirabel became Dr. Mirabel, Ph.D. completed in engineering and education policy. The foundation served 50 villages across 3 countries. Thousands of students had received opportunities they'd never have had otherwise. Several had graduated university and become teachers themselves, the cycle continuing, multiplying, spreading like the mathematical patterns Mirabel had always loved. Her own siblings thrived, all in school, pursuing their own dreams. Her mother lived with Sophia in the village, healthy and happy, tending a garden and telling anyone who'd listen about her brilliant daughter who'd changed the world. Mirabel still taught David, tutoring for college prep now, preparing him for the next phase. But she also designed bridges, her original dream finally manifesting. The first bridge she engineered connected 2 villages and was named after her father. She stood at its opening ceremony and wept, feeling his pride across the distance between life and death. Richard watched them study together one evening, David asking complex questions, Mirabel answering with patient brilliance, and reflected on the dinner party 10 years ago. Rachel's mocking laughter. Mirabel's trembling hands. The casual cruelty of people who'd never questioned their right to diminish others. If he'd come home on schedule that night, he'd have missed everything. The discovery. The transformation. The chance to finally see clearly. His business was different now, focused on impact investing, on funding ventures that actually made the world better. He was less wealthy in pure dollar terms but infinitely richer in purpose. He spoke at conferences, told their story, urged other billionaires to look twice at the people they'd been trained not to see. The greatest return on investment isn't financial, he'd say. It's recognizing brilliance hiding in plain sight. David's high school graduation fell on a perfect spring day. He stood at the podium as valedictorian, looking out at the audience, parents, teachers, friends, and in the front row, 3 people who'd shaped his life in different ways. Richard, graying now but more present than he'd ever been. Rachel, elegant and alone but genuine in ways she hadn't been during his childhood. And Mirabel, trying to be inconspicuous, tears already threatening as she watched the boy she'd taught become a man. "I want to tell you about a teacher," David began his speech. 10 years ago, when I was 6 years old, this woman was working in my house. Cleaning. Serving. Invisible to almost everyone. But she had a secret: she was brilliant. An engineer who'd sacrificed her own dreams to save her family. He told the story, condensed but complete. How his mother's friends had mocked Mirabel at a dinner party. How his father had discovered her teaching him in secret. How everything had changed. "She taught me that mathematics is about patterns," David said. "But the most important pattern she showed me was this: kindness compounds, like interest. Every act of seeing someone's worth multiplies outward. Every moment of recognition creates ripples that touch hundreds of lives." Mirabel was crying now, not bothering to hide it. "I dedicate this achievement to 3 people," David continued. "My father, who learned to be present instead of just providing. My mother, who learned to be honest instead of just perfect. And Miss Mirabel, who never stopped believing I was capable of more than anyone expected, and who taught me to see that brilliance in others." The applause was thunderous. David stepped down from the podium and made his way directly to Mirabel, embracing her tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything." After the ceremony, as families scattered to celebrate, a young woman approached Mirabel hesitantly. She was clearly from a humble background, her clothes simple, her manner nervous. "Dr. Mirabel? I'm Elena Martinez. I'm here on scholarship, from your foundation." Mirabel's breath caught. The pattern continuing. The cycle repeating. "I want to study engineering," Elena said softly. "Like you. Build things that help people. Is that possible?" Mirabel looked at this girl standing where she'd once stood, asking the question she'd once asked, hoping against hope that someone would say yes. "It's absolutely possible," Mirabel said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell me about your dreams." And as Elena began to speak, Richard watched from a distance and understood, this was legacy. Not buildings with his name on them. Not wealth passed down to disinterested heirs. But this endless cycle of recognition and elevation, each person lifting others in turn, brilliance multiplying across generations. That night, Richard stood in his study, the same study where he'd frozen in the doorway 10 years ago. The whiteboard was still there, covered now with David's college application essays and Mirabel's latest bridge designs. He thought about the question people always asked: do you regret it? The custody battle? The media scrutiny? The business costs? The social ostracism? His answer was always the same: I regret only the years before. The years I was blind. The years I walked past brilliance and called it furniture. The years I thought wealth meant anything without wisdom or love or purpose. Through the window, he watched David and Mirabel on the back patio, looking at architectural plans for the 20th Foundation School, David pointing to something and asking questions, Mirabel explaining with patient enthusiasm. Family in the truest sense. Built not on blood, but on choice. On seeing each other clearly. On valuing each person's gifts. On lifting each other toward becoming the best versions of themselves. Richard had been a billionaire who thought he had everything. A nanny had taught him he'd had nothing that mattered. And in learning to see her, he'd finally learned to see himself, and his son, and what it meant to build something that would outlast bank accounts and stock portfolios and all the empty measures of success he'd once pursued. This was wealth. This was legacy. This was love. And it had been there all along, waiting to be noticed. Before we end this story, ask yourself, who have you overlooked today? What brilliance have you walked past? Whose potential have you dismissed because of their position, their clothes, their accent, their job title? The Mirabels of the world are everywhere. Cleaning your offices. Serving your food. Caring for your children. Driving your cars. Invisible to those who've been trained not to see. Hidden geniuses waiting for someone to look twice. To ask questions. To recognize that worth isn't determined by salary or status or social position. The question isn't whether they have potential. The question is, are you willing to see it? If this story touched you, share it. Not for us, but for every overlooked person who needs to be seen. Comment, I see you, if you believe everyone deserves their chance. Let's fill the world with people who look twice. Who ask the right questions. Who recognize brilliance wherever it hides. Because true wealth lies not in what you accumulate, but in what you recognize and elevate in others. The greatest investment you'll ever make is in another person's hidden potential. Thank you for watching. And if someone in your life has been invisible, really see them tomorrow. Ask about their dreams. Listen to their stories. Recognize their worth. You might be surprised by what you discover. You might just change everything.